Welcome back to another story on Arcane Paradox. This time, we're bringing you, what if Veela Queen sensed Harry bound by 53 mate suppressors and 14 nations declared war on Britain. Your likes fuel our creativity. Subscribe and stay tuned. Here's the story. Chapter 1, The smell of chains. The Ministry of Magic smelled like old parchment and ambition, which Harry had decided were essentially the same thing. He stood near the far wall of Level 2's main corridor, doing his absolute best impression of someone who wanted to be there, which was to say, a terrible impression. His dress robes were the least offensive ones Hermione had managed to force onto him before the international summit, deep charcoal gray with silver piping that he'd already loosened at the collar before the lift had even reached the atrium. Around him, witches and wizards from a dozen different countries moved in currents, trailing translators and assistants and the particular energy of people who were very important and very aware of it. Harry was supposedly here as a gesture of goodwill. Dumbledore's words, delivered with that particular warmth that had stopped feeling warm about 2 years ago. Your presence will reassure our international guests, Harry. You represent hope. He'd smiled when the old man said it. He'd gotten very good at smiling. He plucked a glass of something sparkling off a passing tray and didn't drink it. Just held it. It gave his hands something to do. You look like you're planning an escape route. Ron materialized at his elbow, also in dress robes, also with the expression of a man attending his own sentencing. His were maroon. Hermione had not won that argument. I've already identified 3, Harry said. The service corridor behind the magical transportation office, the emergency flow in the attached conference room, and honestly just punching through the wall and operating from the rubble. I'd rate that last one highest. Ron accepted a glass of his own and actually drank it. Hermione's found a French delegate to talk to about magical creature rights legislation. She's been at it for 20 minutes. I've been abandoned. Tragic. Deeply. Ron surveyed the room. There are a lot of French witches here. International summit. A lot of French people here. I noticed. He said it with the particular casualness of someone who had absolutely noticed. Then, lower, the Veela delegation came through the main entrance about 10 minutes ago. Couldn't miss them. Half the room stopped moving. Harry glanced toward the far end of the corridor where the larger reception hall opened up. He could see the edge of the French contingent from here, silver and white and gold, the formal colors of the Veela diplomatic corps, and even from this distance there was something that made looking in that direction feel like looking at a lit window from outside in the cold. He looked away. How long do we have to be here? Dumbledore said. I know what Dumbledore said. Ron was quiet for a moment. 2 hours, maybe. Then the formal dinner, and we can probably disappear after the first course without anyone officially noticing. Right. Harry rolled his shoulder, his left one, which had been aching strangely all morning. Not a pain, exactly. More like pressure. Like something pushing against the inside of his skin that had nowhere to go. He'd been getting it on and off for 3 weeks, always in crowds, always when something in the ambient magic of a space shifted. He'd mentioned it to Madame Pomfrey and she'd given him a calming draught and told him to rest more. He had not rested more. The ache sharpened suddenly, and Harry went very still. It was the strangest sensation, like a sound at a frequency just below hearing, felt in the sternum rather than the ears. Like the moment before lightning. The air in the corridor hadn't changed. The noise level hadn't changed. But something had, and Harry couldn't name it, only that every fine hair on his arms was standing up beneath his robes and his eyes had moved, entirely without his instruction, to the entrance of the reception hall. She walked through it with the particular ease of someone who had never needed to make an entrance because every room she entered already knew it had been honored. She was talking to a short man in diplomatic robes, French ambassador, Harry's brain supplied vaguely, her head tilted slightly, listening, one hand making a small gesture that dismissed whatever he'd just said with the efficiency of someone who had made up her mind 3 sentences before he'd finished speaking. Her hair was silver gold in the ministry's light, swept back from a face that was, Harry's thoughts went briefly sideways. Remarkable wasn't the word, but it was the one his vocabulary had on hand. She was, he realized, Fleur's mother. He'd met Fleur at the Triwizard Tournament 2 years ago. Had seen her at the Burrow occasionally since. She'd always had that quality, that Veela brightness, but it had been the brightness of a candle. This was the sun. Not metaphorically. There was something behind Apollon Delacour's eyes that was old and enormous and entirely unhurried, and when she laughed at something the ambassador said, the sound carried across 20 feet of crowded corridor and landed in Harry's chest like a warm hand pressed flat. Then she stopped. Not slowed. Stopped. Mid-step, mid-word, the way a person stops when they've walked into something invisible. The ambassador took 2 more steps before he realized she wasn't beside him anymore. She was standing absolutely still in the entrance to the reception hall, her chin lifted slightly, and her expression had gone from polished diplomatic attention to something raw and unguarded and confused. She looked confused. And then something else. Something Harry couldn't name because he'd never seen it on a person's face before, a kind of ferocious, disbelieving recognition, like someone who has been told their whole life that a certain thing doesn't exist and has just looked up and seen it standing in the road. Her gaze swept the room. It found him. Harry held very still. He had no idea what was happening. The ache in his shoulder had become something he could only describe as pressure without direction, like his magic itself was straining against something, and the glass in his hand had begun to vibrate very slightly against his palm. Apollon Delacour looked at him across 20 feet of international summit crowding, and her face did something complicated and sovereign and uncertain all at once, and then she began walking toward him. The crowd moved for her without seeming to notice it was moving. People just drifted. Like water. Ron made a small sound beside Harry that might have been oh. She stopped 3 feet away. Up close she was taller than he'd registered, and there was a quality to her stillness that reminded him of the moments just before a spell landed, full of potential, held. Her eyes were a particular shade of blue that didn't seem entirely natural, and right now they were studying him with an intensity that made most of his social responses evaporate. "You are Harry Potter," she said. Not a question. Her accent was precise French, her English faultless. "Generally," he said, because his brain had produced that, and it was either use it or stand there blinking. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Not quite a smile. "I am Apollon Delacour." "I know. Fleur's your daughter." He paused. "I mean, I know who you are." "Obviously. Not just through Fleur." "Obviously," she said, with a gravity that suggested she found him interesting in a way she hadn't expected and wasn't entirely sure she welcomed. She was still studying him. Not the way people usually studied him, looking for the scar, looking for the symbol, tallying up the legend against the reality. She was looking at him, or rather, at something adjacent to him, something in the air around him, and whatever she was seeing was making the line between her brows deepen into something that looked almost like distress. "May I ask you something?" she said, and it wasn't really a question. "And I ask that you do not dismiss it as strange." Harry's eyebrows went up. "All right. Are you in pain?" Ron turned to look at Harry. Harry ignored him. "Not exactly," Harry said. "Why?" Apollon was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. Then she looked past him, over his shoulder, and her expression went from controlled uncertainty to something that was, unmistakably, fury. Cold, very old, very still fury. "Seraphine," she said. The short man in diplomatic robes appeared at her side with the efficiency of someone who had been hovering at a precise distance for exactly this possibility. "My queen." She said something in rapid French that Harry didn't catch. He caught one word, chaînes. Chains. Seraphine Vauquelin went very still. His eyes moved to Harry, and there was something in them, not recognition exactly. More like the expression of a man who has just been handed a document he hoped he would never have to read. "Are you certain?" Vauquelin said, in careful English. "Seraphine. Her voice was flat. Don't ask me that. Right. He turned. We need a privacy ward. Now. Harry looked between them. What's happening? Please, Apollon said, and it was the word of someone who very rarely used it. Come with me. I need to show you something about yourself that you have not been permitted to see. He should have said no. He should have asked more questions. He should have found Dumbledore or Kingsley or literally anyone who could have told him what the protocol was when the Veela Queen pulled you out of an international summit with an expression like the world owed her an apology. He handed Ron his glass and followed her. The conference room off the main corridor was small, 4 chairs, a table, a single window looking out onto the permanent enchanted sky of the Ministry's interior. Apollon sat nothing when they entered. She dismissed Vauquelin with a look, and he went, closing the door behind him, and Harry heard the crackle of a privacy ward going up from the outside. She stood in the middle of the room and looked at him and said, "How long have you had the pain in your left shoulder?" He stared at her. 3 weeks. How did you, and before that? Pressure. Unexplained. In crowds, especially in the presence of strong magic. It wasn't a guess. She was listing his symptoms with the tone of someone reading a diagnosis they already knew. Yes, he said slowly. Madame Pomfrey thought it was stress. It is not stress. She crossed to him, stopped at arm's length. I need you to hold still. I am going to do something and it will be uncomfortable, but it will not harm you. May I? He looked at her. She was waiting, actually asking. There was nothing in her posture that suggested she would proceed without his answer. He found, somewhat to his own surprise, that he trusted that. Yeah, he said. Go ahead. She raised one hand and pressed 2 fingers very lightly against his sternum, through his robes. He felt nothing, at first. And then a warmth that expanded outward from that single point, her magic threading into the air around him like smoke finding its shape, and Harry's breath caught in his throat because he could feel something. He'd never felt it before, which was the terrible part. It was there, in the space between his skin and his magic, and it was wrong. A tightness. No, not tightness. A constriction. Many constrictions. Layered. Old. Some of them so old they'd calcified into something that felt almost like bone, almost like it had always been there, almost like him. Almost. Apollon's hand fell to her side. The silence in the room was the kind that has weight. How many? Harry said, because her expression told him there was a number. 53, she said. Mate suppressors. The words didn't land right, the first time. I'm sorry. Mate suppressors. She said it with the precision of someone who has chosen each word and will not take it back. They are a class of binding that affects creatures with mate bonds, Veela, certain werewolf strains, a handful of others. They do not block magic outright. They compress it. Redirect it. They make the creature unable to sense or project the bond that marks them. She paused. 53 of them, layered over 6 years. Possibly longer. Harry sat down. Not gracefully. He sat because his legs made a unilateral decision. 6 years, he said. At minimum. Her voice was careful. Not gentle, careful, the way you are careful with something that might break or might not and you're not sure which would be worse. Some of the older ones have been there long enough that your magic has built around them. You would not have known. You would only have experienced pressure. Compression. The sense of something you could not name. He looked at his hands. They were steady. Interesting, that. His mind was doing something very loud but his hands were steady. Who put them there, he said. That, she said, is the question. I'm asking it. She met his eyes. The signatures are multiple. I could identify perhaps 4 or 5 with time. But the architecture of the binding, the way they are layered, the particular sequencing, this is not the work of one person. This is coordinated. Institutional. She paused again, shorter this time. I am sorry, Harry Potter. I do not say this to wound you. You're not wounding me, he said, and meant it in a way that meant not yet, ask me in an hour. I just want to know. He stood up again, because sitting felt wrong. He went to the window. Below, through the enchanted view, he could see the imaginary sky, perfect and cloudless and constructed. The mate bond, he said. What does that mean, exactly? What am I supposed to be? He heard her breathe. Just once. You are a Veela dominant. Or rather, you carry the ancestral Veela dominant marker, which hasn't manifested in a recognized bloodline in over 1,000 years. It is not something that appears in human lineage frequently. When it does, she stopped. Then, more quietly, it means you are the natural sovereign mate of my kind. Not a master. Not an owner. A match. A counterbalance. Something we have stories about, the way humans have stories about things they stopped believing in. Harry turned to look at her. And the suppressors. Would ensure you never knew. Would ensure we never found you. Would ensure the bond never activated. Her jaw tightened. Someone went to a great deal of trouble. Yeah, Harry said. Someone always does. The door opened. Vauquelin leaned in, and his face had the expression of a man who had been outside doing calculations and not enjoying the results. My queen, he said in French, and then switched to English, a courtesy that Harry noticed. I have done a preliminary scan from outside the ward. I confirm what you found. Additionally, he paused, I have identified the signature architecture. It matches the binding style of the British Wiesengemot's Department of Creature Regulation, with secondary signatures from at least 3 additional European ministries. He looked at Harry and did something unexpected. He inclined his head. Not a bow, an acknowledgement. And one primary signature that is more personal. Older. More complex. Harry was very quiet. Who? Vauquelin looked at Apollon. She looked at Harry. Albus Dumbledore, she said. Harry heard it and did not move and did not speak for a long moment, and in that moment a great many things rearranged themselves inside him, things he had felt for years and not had the architecture to understand, the way Dumbledore guided him, always toward humility and invisibility, the way every time Harry had felt something enormous in himself Dumbledore had been there with a gentle word about not seeking power, the way he'd been told his whole life that his greatest strength was love. His capacity for sacrifice, his willingness to be small. The pressure in his shoulder built to something almost unbearable and then, cracked. Not loudly. Not with any explosion or light. Just a single, clean snap somewhere in the space between his skin and his magic, and the sensation of it was so sudden and so enormous that Harry's hand went to the wall to steady himself, and for 1 second, one extraordinary second, he felt the size of himself. He had never felt the size of himself before. It was like spending your entire life in a room and suddenly discovering the room had walls you couldn't see, that the space extended in every direction further than you could measure, that you were not the small thing in the center of a small room but something vast and ancient and entirely capable. Then it contracted again, the other 52 suppressors reasserting, and he was just Harry in a conference room with his hand on the wall, breathing too fast. One broke, Apollon said softly, and there was something in her voice that wasn't entirely professional. I noticed, he said. She crossed to him. Not quickly. The way she moved everything, with the certainty of someone who has decided. She stopped beside him, and this close he could feel the edge of her magic, a warmth like held sunlight, and the remaining suppressors in him did something he could only describe as straining toward it. This is why they were afraid, she said. It wasn't said to comfort him. Just stated. The way she stated facts. A Veela dominant who is also the chosen one, who survived Voldemort twice, who carries whatever it is you carry, they did not want to know what you would become without chains. I'm not particularly interested in what they wanted, Harry said, and heard his own voice like it was someone else's, quieter than usual, and very level. I'm interested in taking them off. Apollon looked at him, and for the first time since she'd walked into that reception hall with the world rearranging around her, something in her expression opened. Not softened, opened. Like a door. That, she said, is going to start a war. How many nations, he asked, because the way she said it wasn't a warning. It was, somehow, an offering. She considered him for a moment. How many do you want? None, Harry said. I never want wars. But I'm done asking what other people want. Vauquelin, from the doorway, said, for what it is worth, Mr. Potter, France will stand first. Harry looked at him. Then at Apollon. He felt the remaining suppressors pressing down, 52 of them, all that layered institutional terror of what he might be, all those years of careful small-making. He felt them the way you feel the weight of something once you know it's there. All right, he said. Then let's start. They came back into the corridor and the summit was still happening around them, oblivious, 100 conversations about international magical cooperation and bilateral creature rights agreements and trade pact renewals, and Harry walked through it differently than he'd walked through it an hour ago. Not visibly. He wasn't throwing sparks or moving furniture with his mind. But something had shifted in the quality of his stillness, the way he occupied space, and Ron spotted it immediately because Ron had been reading Harry Potter for 6 years and could tell. What happened? Ron said, falling into step beside him. Something I should have found out a long time ago. Ron looked at Apollon, who was 3 steps ahead, already engaging her ambassador with rapid quiet French. Are you in trouble? I've been in trouble since I was 11 months old, Ron. This is different. Harry looked at him. I'll explain everything. But not here. Hermione materialized from the direction of the French delegation, slightly flushed from whatever debate she'd been winning. She took one look at Harry's face and stopped. What's wrong? Nothing's wrong, he said, and surprised himself by meaning it. I just found out that several people I trusted have been doing something to my magic for 6 years, that I'm apparently something called a Veela dominant which hasn't existed in 1,000 years, and that France is probably going to declare war on Britain over it. Hermione stared at him. I'm sorry. I'll explain it all later. Harry, Hermione. He touched her arm briefly. I'm not panicking. So please don't panic for me. Can you do that? She searched his face. Whatever she found there, that new quality, that stillness that wasn't emptiness but something more like depth, made her breathe out slowly and say, all right. But you're explaining everything. Everything. Deal. Across the room, Dumbledore had appeared at the far entrance to the reception hall. White beard, half-moon spectacles, the blue robes he always wore to ministry events. He was talking to Minister Fudge with an expression of benign attentiveness, his hands folded on his cane, and he looked, Harry searched for the word, precisely the same as he always looked. That was the thing. That patient, grandfatherly, just so inevitability. Harry looked at him across the room. Dumbledore's eyes moved, as they always did in crowds, always finding Harry, the habit of a man who kept close watch on something he valued, and they met his, and for just a moment Harry held that gaze without smiling, without performing, without offering the old man the particular expression of trust and deference that he'd been providing for 6 years like a tithe. He just looked. He saw Dumbledore register it, a micro-expression, barely there. A flicker of something behind the half-moon spectacles. Something that might have been concern. Then the grandfatherly warmth smoothed back into place and Dumbledore tilted his head in a faint nod that was his version of "we'll talk later." Harry looked away first, but not the way he usually looked away, not yielding. Just done. Apollon reappeared at his side with the smoothness of someone who had never needed to excuse herself. He is here, she said quietly, not looking toward Dumbledore. I know. Do you want to confront him now? Harry considered this. Around him the summit moved and glittered and consumed itself. Through the ceiling, through the floors, through the stone and the magic and the politics, he could feel, faintly, through 52 remaining locks, something that wanted out. Not violence. Not anger. Just himself. No, he said. Not yet. Not here. Not where he gets to control the environment. Apollin's look carried a precise, quiet approval. Good, she said. When we confront him, Harry said, I want at least 3 more of those things off me first. Is that possible? We'll need somewhere private. My accommodations at the French embassy are warded to the standard of a small fortress. Of course they are, Harry said. Something shifted at the corner of her mouth. Closer to a smile this time. You sound like Fleur. I'll take that. He glanced at her. She's going to lose her mind when I tell her about this. She is going to lose her mind, Apollin agreed, with the tone of a mother who knows her daughter extremely well. She will also almost certainly attempt to personally dismantle every suppressor herself, which she is talented enough to try and unskilled enough to fail at. So she gets told last. She gets told third, Apollin said. After your friends, who need to understand what is happening. We may need allies who are trusted and mobile. Harry nodded. He looked at Ron and Hermione, who were standing a careful distance away, Hermione's expression suggesting she was processing approximately 6 things at once and Ron suggesting he had decided to process exactly none of them until he had more information. Good people, Harry thought. Not for the first time, and not lightly. All right, he said. We leave in an hour. I'll make sure we're not followed. You're aware that Dumbledore has people watching you? 3. A wizard in grey robes near the canopy table, a witch with the Daily Prophet credentials who hasn't interviewed anyone, and the man standing by the service corridor pretending to check his watch. He said it without heat, without hurry. Just fact. I've been clocking Dumbledore's surveillance since 5th year. Apollin looked at him. Something moved in those not entirely natural blue eyes, something that was not pity and not quite admiration, but somewhere between the two, with something else beneath it that she visibly chose not to examine. 53 suppressors, she said, almost to herself. And you still noticed. They underestimated me, Harry said. Everyone does. I've stopped minding. She laughed, short and real and warmer than anything he'd expected from her. Around them, heads turned at the sound, because the Veela Queen's laughter was not a thing rooms ignored. Harry didn't look at the turning heads. He watched her face do the thing it did when she stopped performing, and he thought, I understand that. The space between the performance and the person. I know exactly what that space feels like. He offered her his arm, because they were in the middle of an international summit and appearances were a tool like any other. Should we go back in there and be seen being politely diplomatic for another 45 minutes? She looked at his arm. Then at him. Then she took it, with the precision of someone making a calculated choice. We should, she said. We should be very visible and very composed and give Dumbledore absolutely nothing to act on until we are ready. See, Harry said, walking with her toward the reception hall, we're going to get along fine. Don't flatter yourself, she said, but she didn't pull her arm away. Behind them, Ron watched them go and then turned to Hermione and said, I have so many questions. So do I, Hermione said, already reaching for her small beaded bag where she kept, among approximately 800 other things, a notebook. Starting with the legal precedent for cross-national mate bond suppression under the 1847 International Magical Covenant, which I'm fairly certain, Hermione. Is a Class 3 violation, which would explain why France, Hermione. What? Is Harry all right? She looked across the reception hall to where Harry stood beside Apollin Delacour, lifting a glass of champagne from a passing tray with the easy calm of someone who had just decided something enormous and was absolutely at peace with it. I think, she said slowly, he might be better than all right. She paused. I think he might be becoming something they should have always let him be. Ron followed her gaze. Yeah, he said quietly. That's what worries me. It shouldn't, Hermione said. It should worry them. Across the room, Dumbledore watched Harry Potter laugh at something the Veela Queen said, and his hands tightened almost imperceptibly on his cane, and something that lived behind the twinkle in his eyes, something old and careful and terribly, terribly afraid of what it might have miscalculated, stirred. He excused himself from Fudge's company. He needed to make some calls. The French embassy occupied a slice of magical London that didn't exist on any Muggle map and was warded with the kind of thoroughness that came from a nation that had been doing international magical politics for 800 years and had learned, the hard way, to take security seriously. Harry stood outside it at 10:30 that night, with Ron and Hermione beside him, and felt the wards brush against him as they approached. The wards brushed back. Not aggressively, more like a question. Who are you, really? The remaining 52 suppressors tightened in response, the way a fist tightens around something it's not supposed to have, and Harry's jaw set. He reached into his pocket and produced the embassy pass that Vauquelin had pressed into his hand at the summit, 3 hours ago, with the efficiency of a man who had been expecting this exact sequence of events. The wards read the pass and then did something unexpected. They read him. Not the surface of him, beneath that. Through the suppressors, through the layers, down to something the pass had recognized but the wards wanted to confirm. Then they stepped aside like they were greeting someone they'd been waiting for. That was different, Ron said. The wards are Veela calibrated, Hermione said, because of course she knew. They would recognize. She stopped, glanced at Harry. They recognized you. Apparently I'm recognizable, Harry said. Once you get past 52 layers of someone else's decisions about what I should be. He said it mildly. He walked through the gate. Apollon was waiting in the entrance hall, out of her summit robes now and in something simpler, and beside her was Fleur, who had arrived 2 hours ago from Paris and who was looking at Harry with an expression that suggested she had been briefed, was furious, and had strong opinions. All of which proved correct within approximately 10 seconds. Harry, Fleur said, and then, without preamble, I am going to destroy every person who did this to you. In order, Harry said. Let's figure out what this is first. Fleur grabbed his arm and pulled him into a hug that was fierce and brief and entirely sincere, and Harry held on for a second because, it was Fleur. She was a person who made you feel like your anger was valid and your worth was obvious and anyone who thought otherwise would hear about it. Come, Apollon said, already moving toward the interior of the embassy. We have work to do. They followed her into a room that was large and warm and warded 6 ways, where a fire burned and 4 chairs had been arranged around a low table, and where Seraphine Vauquelin sat with a stack of documents and the expression of a man who had been writing things down and hating every line. Harry sat. For the first time since that corridor, since the first suppressor had cracked loose, since he'd felt the enormous and impossible size of himself, he sat, and looked at the room full of people who were, each in their own way, choosing to stand on his side of whatever was coming. All right, he said. Tell me everything. The fire crackled. Vauquelin opened the first document. Outside, London moved through its ordinary night, entirely unaware that something had shifted in its magical foundations, that a chain had started to break, link by link, and that the world on the other side of that breaking was going to look nothing like the world before it. 52 suppressors. And Harry Potter, for the first time in 6 years, could feel the edges of himself. He was going to need every one of them gone. Chapter 2, the shape of what was taken. Vauquelin's documents were meticulous in the way that only truly angry people's documents are, every line precise, every footnote sourced, every damning fact laid out with the cold fury of a man who had been building a case and praying he'd never need it. He spread them across the low table one at a time, and Harry read each one without interrupting, which seemed to surprise everyone in the room except Apollon, who had already taken the measure of him and adjusted her expectations accordingly. The first document was a magical trace analysis, 19 pages of runic notation that Hermione leaned over Harry's shoulder to read and went progressively paler through. It mapped the suppressor signatures the way a cartographer maps a coastline, methodically, completely, with no mercy for the landscape. 53 binding points. 14 distinct caster signatures. 6 years of layered application, some suppressors added annually, some all at once, some clearly in response to specific events. Harry found one cluster dated to the summer after 4th year. After the graveyard. After Voldemort. He put his finger on that cluster and didn't say anything, and the room was quiet enough that no one asked him to. The signatures, Hermione said, her voice doing the thing it did when she was holding herself very controlled because the alternative was shouting. I can identify 3 of these without even cross-referencing. This one, she pointed, is standard Wisengamot binding notation. This is the Department for the Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures. And this, she stopped. Say it, Harry said. That's Dumbledore's, she said. I've seen his spell work in restricted texts. The harmonic sequencing is distinctive. He invented at least 2 of these specific binding variations. They don't exist anywhere else. The fire popped. No one else spoke. Ron had been sitting very still for the last 10 minutes, which for Ron meant something was happening behind his eyes that he hadn't found the words for yet. He found them now. He built them himself, Ron said. New ones. Specifically for Harry. Yes, Vauquelin said. That's not protecting someone. That's not even controlling someone. Ron looked at Harry. That's crafting a cage and calling it a gift. Harry looked at the dated cluster under his finger. Summer after 4th year. He'd come back from the graveyard with Cedric's body and Voldemort's return and the full weight of what his life was going to keep being, and while he'd been at the Dursleys that summer, while he'd been sitting in his room with the window open and the despair thick and no one writing back to his letters, someone had come to him while he slept, or eaten something, or been in a room where a spell could find him, and added 2 more locks. He took his finger off the document. What's the removal process, he said. Apollon, who had been watching him the way you watch something you're not certain of, said, it depends on the suppressor. The newer ones, the last 2 years, are lighter. They came off easier because they were added more recently and your magic hasn't fully incorporated them. The middle layers will be harder. The oldest ones, she paused. The oldest ones have been there so long that removing them incorrectly would be like removing load-bearing walls. The structure would react. React how? Your magic would surge. Uncontrollably. She said it plainly. Not because it wants to harm anyone. But because it has been compressed for 6 years and it needs room. Like water when a dam breaks. So we do it carefully, Harry said. We do it in stages, Apollon said. Over days, possibly a week. Each removal needs time for your magic to acclimate to the additional freedom. Rushing it would, I'm not rushing it, Harry said. I just want to start. Fleur, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, said, we should do one tonight. Another one went on its own this afternoon, one more voluntarily removed will tell us how his magic responds. She looked at her mother. And it will tell him something. Apollon considered this. Her eyes moved to Harry with that quality she had, not asking permission, exactly. Assessing. Are you willing to be uncomfortable? I've been uncomfortable for 6 years, Harry said. I just didn't know why. She stood, and crossed to him, and everyone in the room seemed to instinctively give them space, chairs shifting, bodies turning, as though the act required a certain privacy. Apollon stood in front of Harry and he looked up at her from the chair and she said, quietly, so only he could hear, tell me immediately if it becomes pain. It won't, he said. You don't know that. You're right, he said. I'll tell you. She pressed her hand flat against his sternum again, and this time he was expecting the warmth, the threading of her magic into the space around him, but it was still, considerable. Still something that his remaining suppressors strained against like compass needles toward north. He heard Hermione make a small sound from the other side of the room and knew she could see something manifesting in the air, the subtle luminescence that Veela magic sometimes cast when deployed. Apollon found the second suppressor. He felt her find it, a specific tightness near his left shoulder that she pressed against with something precise and sure, and she began to work. It took 11 minutes. He knew because he watched the clock on the mantel, not because time felt long but because he needed something to look at other than her face while she worked, and her face was too close to look at without it becoming something he'd have to think about later. He stared at the clock and breathed steadily and felt the suppressor resist, felt it calcify and push back and cling with the stubbornness of something that had been part of his architecture for years. And then Apollon said something in French, short, sharp, the word of a woman who doesn't repeat herself, and pulled. The suppressor came out like a splinter. The sensation was indescribable. Not pain, but not comfortable either, a release so specific and so total that his whole body registered it as shock. He felt his magic expand into the newly freed space like a first breath after being held underwater, and for 3 seconds the room went very bright and the documents on the table lifted off in a ring and the fire roared 2 feet higher than physics required. Then it settled. Harry breathed. In. Out. Found the floor with his feet. Found the chair with his hands. All right? Apollon said. Yeah, he said, and his voice came out steadier than he expected. Yeah, that was, he stopped. That was 2 years of my life right there. That one was 2 years old. I know, she said. I can feel the age of them. He looked at her. What does it feel like? From your side? She was quiet for a moment. She wasn't often quiet, her silences were decisions rather than absences, and this one was a decision to be honest. It feels like finding something that belongs in a certain place and has been kept in a box, she said. And the box is wrong. And you always knew something was wrong, you just didn't have the language for it. She held his gaze. Until today. Something moved between them, not the bond, or not only the bond. Something more ordinary and therefore more surprising. Recognition. The particularly human kind, where two people look at each other and register that the other person has been somewhere similar, in their own way. Harry broke it by looking at Ron, who had watched the whole procedure with his hands clasped between his knees and an expression of forced calm that cracked slightly when Harry met his eyes. 2 down, Harry said. Ron breathed out. 51 to go. I'm counting. I know you are. Ron met his gaze. Good. Vauquelin waited until Apollon had sat back down and Fleur had pushed a cup of tea toward Harry before he opened the second folder. He was efficient about it, no preamble, no softening. The international legal position, he said, spreading several pages across the table. Mate suppression is addressed under the 1847 International Magical Covenant, Article 17, Section C, specifically, no signatory nation may apply binding magic to the mate markers of a creature or creature-adjacent being without documented consent from both the affected party and the creature body they are bonded to. He paused. Britain is a signatory. The Veela nation is a recognized creature body under the covenant. Hermione made the sound she made when she'd been right about something she'd hoped she was wrong about. So what was done to Harry is, it's not just illegal under British law, it is a violation of international treaty, Vauquelin said. Specifically, it constitutes unprovoked magical assault on a creature-bonded individual and interference with the sovereign interests of the Veela nation. He looked at Apollon. Which gives us standing. To do what? Ron said. To do whatever we determine is proportionate, Apollon said. Her voice was measured. Not cold, certain, which was different. Cold is the absence of feeling. Certain is the presence of decision. I have already been in contact with the High Council. When I tell them what I found today, they will authorize a formal response. What kind of response? Harry said. The kind that starts with a declaration, she said, and something moved in her expression, not pleasure, not eagerness. More like the particular gravity of someone who has done the math and doesn't enjoy the answer but will not pretend it's different than it is. France will be first. We have treaty obligations with 11 other Veela allied nations. I expect them to follow within hours. And the other two? Hermione said. She was doing the arithmetic. You said 14 nations. There are 2 neutral parties who have been watching Britain's treatment of magical creatures and creature-bonded individuals for years. Vauquelin's expression was precise. They have been looking for a formal trigger. This will be theirs. The room was quiet for a moment, the weight of 14 nations settling into the space like weather. I want to be clear about something, Harry said. Everyone looked at him. I'm not a cause. I'm not a symbol. I'm not going to be the reason a war starts and then sit in a tower somewhere while it happens. Whatever comes, I'm in it. No one said otherwise, Apollon said. Dumbledore will. Harry looked at her steadily. He'll say this is dangerous. He'll say I need to be protected. He'll say the right move is for me to step back and let the adults handle it and trust that they have my best interests. He stopped. Breathed. He'll say all the things he's always said, and he'll mean them, and he'll be wrong. Apollon held his gaze. Then we ensure he doesn't have the opportunity to say them at the wrong moment. We confront him tomorrow, Harry said. It wasn't a question. Tomorrow, she agreed. On our terms. At a time and place of our choosing. Fleur, who had been cycling between fury and something quieter for the past hour, put down her teacup. I want to be there, she said. When you confront him. You'll be there, Harry said. And your friends? She looked at Ron and Hermione. Also there, Ron said, with the tone of someone who had not been asked and was clarifying that asking was unnecessary. Hermione nodded. She had the look she got when she'd moved from emotional processing to tactical processing, eyes slightly unfocused, fingers still, like she was running scenarios in her mind. The confrontation needs to happen before Dumbledore knows about the declarations, she said. Once the diplomatic situation becomes public, he'll go defensive. He'll have the entire Wisengamot around him and 12 PR arguments ready. His protective instinct is institutional, Vauquelin agreed. He will retreat into the machinery of British magical government. It will be much harder to reach him in there. So we move before the machine knows it needs protecting him, Harry said. That means early tomorrow. Before the morning papers. Before the diplomatic channels go live. He looked at Apollon. She was watching him with an expression he was starting to learn, not surprise, exactly. More like the continuous mild recalibration of someone whose initial estimate had been wrong in an interesting direction. You think quickly, she said. I've had to. He said it without bitterness. Just fact. Dumbledore moves in months and years. I've had to learn to move in minutes. Yes, she said, quietly. I imagine you have. They moved to separate rooms around midnight. Hermione commandeered a corner table in the embassy's library and began cross-referencing the treaty articles with a speed that suggested she'd already been thinking about this for 3 hours. Ron followed Harry to the small sitting room they'd been given, and they sat in the kind of companionable quiet that only works between people who have been through things together and don't need to perform normalcy for each other. How are you actually doing? Ron said, after a while. Harry thought about performing fine. Discarded it. Weird, he said. It's like, you know when you've had a headache for so long that you stop noticing it? And then it goes away and you can't believe you were living like that? Yeah. It's that. But for my whole self. He stared at the ceiling. I keep feeling the edges of the second one that came off and being surprised. That there's that much more space there than I thought. And the other 51. Yeah. Ron was quiet for a moment. Harry. Dumbledore. He said it carefully, the way you say a name when what you mean is a whole complicated grief. I know, Harry said. He genuinely, I know, Ron. He genuinely cares. He genuinely believed whatever he told himself about why this was necessary. Harry closed his eyes briefly. That's the part I'm going to have to sit with. Not the chains. The fact that he looked at me and thought chains were kindness. Ron didn't offer a rebuttal, which was the right move. Just sat with it. The Veela thing, Ron said, after a while. The dominant thing. What does it actually mean? Day to day, I mean. Not the 1,000-year legend version. Harry laughed, short and genuine. I have no idea. Apollons explained the theory. In practice I have 51 more locks to lose before I find out. He paused. She said it's like a counterbalance. Not a leader. Not someone who controls. Just, something that balances them, the way a key fits a lock. That sounds better than the prophecy version of your destiny, Ron said. Less dying. Significantly less dying, hopefully. So, and I'm asking as your best mate who has your complete best interests at heart, is Apollon Delacour, don't, Harry said. I'm just saying, Ron. She looked at you like, we are not doing this. Like you were a window she'd been looking for, go to sleep, Ronald. Ron grinned, the wide, real one that he kept for moments when things were terrible but somehow still funny. All I'm saying is that this is either the best or worst thing that's ever happened to you and I honestly can't tell which yet. That's basically the description of my entire life, Harry said, and Ron laughed, and for a few minutes the weight lifted enough that they were just two 17-year-olds sitting in an expensive French embassy at midnight, and the world hadn't ended yet. Morning arrived cold and grey, which was London's preferred setting for confrontations of historical significance. Harry was up before dawn, which surprised nobody except perhaps the embassy staff who found him already in the kitchen, making tea, with the focused quiet of someone who had slept well because they had decided to and had needed the sleep and had no patience for the alternative. He'd made peace with the previous day somewhere between 2 and 3 in the morning, and what he'd arrived at wasn't acceptance exactly. More like clarity. He knew what was true. He knew what he was going to do. The feelings about all of it could come later, when there was room. Apollon found him there at 6. She was in dark robes already, her hair loose this morning rather than up, and she moved through the kitchen with the ease of someone at home in their own spaces. She looked at the tea he'd made without being asked and sat down across from him. You slept, she said. Not a question. 4 hours. He passed her a cup. You. 3. She wrapped her hands around it. I was writing to the High Council. What did they say? They said they would follow my lead. Something complicated moved in her expression, pride and its discomforts. They always say that. It is sometimes a weight. Yeah, Harry said. I know something about that. She looked at him over the rim of her cup. In the early morning light, without the summit and the politics and the formal gravity of the previous evening, she looked different. Not less, nothing about her was less, but realer. Like a painting seen up close, where you can see the individual brushstrokes and the painting becomes more impressive for it, not less. When we go to Dumbledore, she said, you should lead. He'd expected her to lead. He'd assumed, she was the Veela queen, she had the treaty standing, she had the political weight. Why me? Because he will dismiss everything I say as the interests of a foreign power. She said it without resentment, just accurately. But he cannot dismiss you. You are the person he did this to. You are the one he will have to answer to in the end. She paused. Also, she added, with a small shift in her expression, I suspect watching him attempt to explain himself to you will clarify a great deal. You want to see how he reacts. I want to see if he apologizes or justifies, she said. It will tell us everything about how the next month proceeds. Harry considered this. Then, what if he tries something? Her expression went very still. Then he will learn something about what he was suppressing. I can handle Dumbledore. I know you can, she said. Simple. No caveat, no qualification. She said it the way you say something that is simply true and requires no decoration, and Harry felt the matter-of-factness of it land somewhere in his chest and stay there. He turned his teacup in his hands. The other suppressors, he said. After today. After the confrontation. How do we do the next ones without drawing attention? If Dumbledore goes defensive, he'll try to, I don't know. Block access. Get the Wizengamot to issue some kind of restraining, let him try, Apollon said, and there was something in it that wasn't arrogance but was its more dangerous cousin, certainty backed by preparation. By the time he reaches the Wizengamot, the declarations will have been filed. Once 14 nations have declared violations under the Covenant, British magical law does not supersede. The International Tribunal takes jurisdiction. So we're in a race, Harry said. We're in a sequence, she corrected. Racing implies uncertainty about the outcome. He looked at her. You're very confident. I am very prepared, she said. There's a difference. I've been doing this for 20 years, Harry. I have made mistakes when I was confident. I have not made many when I was prepared. He liked that. He liked the precision of it, the way she inhabited her own expertise without performing it. He'd spent 6 years watching Dumbledore be wise, performatively wise, wisdom as a social tool, and this was different. This was the thing itself. All right, he said. We go at 8. Hogwarts or the Ministry? Where will he be? Hogwarts. Mondays he's always at Hogwarts. It's a school day. Something struck Harry as almost absurd about that, the idea that amid all of this, there was still a school day. He'll be at breakfast. Then we go to Hogwarts. There were 7 of them when they walked through Hogwarts front gates at 8:15, Harry and Apollon side by side, Fleur and Vauquelin a step behind, Ron and Hermione a half step behind them, and a young Veela diplomat from Apollon's staff named Kaelin whose primary function appeared to be carrying the treaty documentation and looking absolutely implacable while doing it. The gates opened for Harry before anyone touched them. The castle beyond was morning quiet, students at breakfast in the Great Hall, staff not yet in their corridors. Harry could feel the wards as they passed through, the way you feel warm air stepping out of the cold, and the wards did to him what the embassy wards had done last night. They asked, and then they recognized, and then they did something they'd never done in 6 years of Harry walking through this gate. They greeted him. Not with bells or fireworks. Something subtler. A resonance, like a held note. Like the castle had spent 6 years knowing something was present that it couldn't quite touch, and now the distance had shrunk 2 measures. The wards know, Fleur said softly, from behind him. The castle's old enough to feel the Veela markers, Apollon said, equally soft. It's been here longer than the suppressors. Harry didn't stop walking. The main doors opened from 100 yards as they approached, which he chose to interpret as a good sign. He went directly to the headmaster's office. He didn't send word ahead. He didn't knock on the door of the stone gargoyle, he told it to move in a voice that assumed compliance, and the gargoyle, to everyone's visible surprise, moved. Apparently the enchantments on the office entrance had the same response to him this morning as the wards had, something newly, barely freed had changed the register of how this castle perceived him, and the castle was paying attention. They went up the spiral stairs and Harry opened the door. Dumbledore was at his desk. He was not alone, Professor McGonagall was there, and Snape, who had been saying something mid-sentence that stopped the moment the door opened. All 3 of them looked at the 7 people walking through the headmaster's door on a Monday morning, and a great deal happened in the room in the space of about 4 seconds. McGonagall's eyes went to Harry, then to Apollon, and her expression ran through surprise and concern, and a very McGonagall-specific version of this is going to be complicated. Snape's expression went closed and careful, which was his version of the same thing. And Dumbledore looked at Harry. Not at Apollon, not at the diplomatic envoy, not at the treaty folder under Kaelin's arm. At Harry. And what Harry saw in those blue eyes was, not guilt, exactly. Not yet. More like the expression of a man who has been running a very long game and has just heard the opening move of a countergame he didn't predict. Harry, Dumbledore said, with the warmth. Always with the warmth. And Apollon, what a pleasant surprise. To what do we owe, you know why we're here, Harry said. Dumbledore's expression didn't flicker. Perhaps you'd like to sit down. Let me have Fawkes call for some tea, 53, Harry said. Silence. 53 mate suppressors, Harry said, into that silence, and he kept his voice level because he had decided the previous night that he would be completely, mercilessly calm for this, that he would not give anyone in this room the relief of watching him break down. 6 years. Some of them your own invention. Would you like to tell me which part of that was for my protection? The room was very still. On his perch in the corner, Fawkes made a sound, not a song, just a note, low and private. Snape said nothing, which told Harry something. McGonagall said, Albus, and her voice was very quiet. Dumbledore put down his quill. Folded his hands. And then he did the thing Harry had spent years watching him do, he took a breath, settled into his wisdom like settling into a favorite chair, and began. Harry, he said. There is so much context, then provided, Harry said. I'm listening. But I want the truth, not the version of the truth that makes your choices look kind. Something shifted in Dumbledore's face. Just slightly. The warmth banked, just a little, replaced by something older and more complicated. He looked, for just a moment, at Apollon. You have identified the bindings, he said. Every single one, she said. Her voice was the temperature of marble. Including the 3 that violate Article 17 of the 1847 Covenant. Including the 6 that were applied without documented consent, to a minor, on behalf of institutions that had no legal right to authorize them. She paused. I assume you would like to know how many nations are currently reviewing their obligations under the Covenant regarding this matter. Dumbledore was quiet for 2 seconds. How many? 14, Vauquelin said, and opened the folder. Something happened in the room then, not physically, not magically, just atmospherically. The quality of the air shifted the way it shifts before weather. Snape had gone very still. McGonagall's hand had come up to her mouth. Dumbledore looked at the folder and then at Harry and then, for the first time in Harry's memory, he looked, not defeated, nothing so simple. But he looked like a man who understood that the architecture of his intentions had failed to account for something structural, and the building was showing the stress. I made decisions, Dumbledore said, that I believed were necessary. Tell me which ones, Harry said. Specifically. The suppressors, he began. Were your idea? Harry said. A pause. Initially. Yes. You approached the Wizengamot. I recommended a course of action. And the 3 European ministries. Another pause, longer. I reached out to certain allies. Who shared my concerns about what an unrestrained Veela dominant, with your particular magical history, might what? Harry said. Be too powerful. Want things. Have opinions about how I'd been treated. Destabilize, Dumbledore said, and there was a genuine gravity in it, the conviction of someone who believes what they're saying, which made it worse and not better. A dominant bond triggers an enormous alignment of magical and political power. The Veela nation would have oriented toward you. The ripple effects would have been mine to navigate, Harry said. My life. My power. My bond. He held the old man's gaze. You had no right. No, Dumbledore said, after a moment. No, I did not. I had reasons. I should not confuse the two. The room absorbed this admission. It was the closest thing to an apology any of them were going to get in this room, and everyone present seemed to understand that simultaneously. Harry looked at him for a long moment. He thought about being 11 years old, stepping into this office for the first time, looking at this man and feeling, seen. Safe. Like someone finally knew what to do with him. He thought about how long he'd been running on the fuel of that feeling, even when the evidence had started to erode it. Even when the silences had become too studied and the guidance had become too precise. I'm going to remove the rest of the suppressors, Harry said. You're not going to try to stop it. Harry, you're not going to involve the Wiesengemot, or the Ministry, or anyone else. You're going to sit here and you're going to let the international process happen. He paused. Because if you try to use any institution to block it, I will not be the one who makes your life difficult. It'll be 14 nations doing it, and they will be entirely within their legal rights. He could feel Apollon beside him, not moving, not speaking. Just there. The way something steady is there. Dumbledore looked at him with those eyes that had always seen too much, and what was in them now was not the twinkle, not the warmth, not the performance of wisdom. What was there was something real and sad and complicated. The expression of a man who has spent his life being right enough, often enough, that he'd forgotten to check whether he was right about the most important thing. There were fears, Dumbledore said quietly. They were not invented fears, Harry. The magical signature you carry, what a Veela dominant represents, the last time one manifested, in the 10th century, it reshaped the political landscape of magical Europe. 3 wars. Hundreds of deaths. He was unrestrained and untrained and left without support by institutions that feared him, Apollon said, her voice precise as a blade's edge. It was not the dominant that caused the wars. It was the response to him. She held Dumbledore's gaze. Your historians recorded the fire. They did not record who struck the first spark. The silence after that had a quality that suggested no one in the room had a response. McGonagall said, carefully, what happens now? Now, Harry said, the suppressors come off. And then we see. He turned and walked to the door, and the 6 people who'd come with him fell in around him like they'd been doing it for years, and at the door he stopped and looked back at Dumbledore one more time. For what it's worth, Harry said, and meant it, because he could hold 2 things at once, I know you thought you were protecting me. I know that's true. He paused. That's almost the worst part. He left. Dumbledore sat alone at his desk for a long time after they'd gone, and didn't call for tea, and didn't reach for his quill, and on his perch in the corner Fawkes sang one quiet note and then went still. They worked through 4 more suppressors that afternoon, in the embassy's warded sitting room, with Hermione taking detailed notes and Ron keeping watch and Vauquelin managing the documentation flow with the efficiency of a man born to the work. Each one was different. The 3rd came off cleanly, barely a flicker, it had been new, badly integrated, clearly added in haste. The 4th dragged, resistant, 5 years embedded, and when it finally released Harry's temperature spiked for 30 seconds and every candle in the room flared. The 5th one sat at the edge of his core magic, deeply woven, and Apollon worked on it for 40 minutes with a concentration so total that no one in the room spoke, and when it finally broke free Harry made a sound he immediately regretted because it was involuntary and undignified, and the windows blew open and a wind moved through the room that smelled, inexplicably, like a storm over open water. Better? Apollon said, breathing slightly harder than usual. Define better, Harry said. His voice was rough. His hands were shaking, not from weakness but from the surplus of energy suddenly having no direction. She reached out and put her hand over his on the arm of the chair, pressing firmly. The warmth of her Veela magic moved through him like a hand smoothing a wrinkled surface, and the shaking stopped. Neither of them mentioned it. 5, Hermione said from the corner, her voice carefully neutral. 5 removed in just over 24 hours. 48 to go, Ron said. 48, Harry confirmed. He looked at his hands, steady now. They get heavier as we go deeper. They will, Apollon said. She had moved back to her chair, put professional distance back in place. The ones remaining are older. More personal. She met his eyes. 2 of them are so deeply embedded that removing them will be significant. How significant? She was quiet for a moment, choosing her words. The magical response will be large enough that I would prefer to do those away from population centers. Harry stared at her. Are you telling me I'm going to explode? I'm telling you, she said, with complete composure, that the castle at Hogwarts might need to brace itself. And that is not a joke. Ron said, that's incredibly cool, and then looked at Hermione and added, obviously also a serious concern. Obviously, Hermione said, but her lips were twitching. Harry laughed. He hadn't expected to, and the laugh surprised him, genuine, unguarded, there and gone. And for the length of it he wasn't the chosen one or the boy who lived or the Veela dominant or the subject of 14 international declarations. He was just Harry, and his friends were around him, and Apollon Delacour was watching him with an expression she hadn't schooled fast enough. He caught it. The expression. The unguarded edge of it. She looked away first. Harry let it go, for now. There were 48 suppressors to remove, 14 nations to manage, and Dumbledore sitting in his office reckoning with something. There was plenty of time to be complicated about everything else. Plenty of time. For the first time in 6 years, he had the extraordinary luxury of thinking in terms of time. By nightfall, Vauquelin had received confirmation from 11 of the 14 nations. The declarations were drafted, sealed, ready to file with the International Magical Tribunal at dawn. France would speak first. In the morning, Britain was going to wake up to something it had not experienced in 800 years. And Harry Potter, with 5 fewer chains and 48 to go, slept better than he had in years, in a room in the French embassy, while outside London moved through its last ordinary night for a very long time. Chapter 3, Declaration. The morning edition of the Daily Prophet landed on breakfast tables across Britain at 7:15 with a headline so large that the typesetter had apparently run out of room for nuance. 14 nations declare Britain in violation of international magical covenant, full diplomatic crisis imminent. Below it, in slightly smaller text, Veela Queen at center of explosive summit fallout, ministry issues no comment. Harry read it over his toast at the embassy kitchen table and thought, that's going to ruin someone's morning. He felt no particular satisfaction about it. Just the clean, practical acknowledgement that the sequence had started and there was no pausing it now. Fleur dropped into the chair across from him and spun the paper to read the headline herself. Her expression went through several things quickly, settling on something that was equal parts grim and gratified. 12 hours, she said. We gave them 12 hours before it became public and they still had no comment ready. Fudge doesn't function well under surprise, Harry said. No minister does. She poured herself coffee with the decisive movement of someone who needed it. Maman is already in the communications room. She's been there since 5. I know. I could hear Vauquelin dictating statements through the wall at 4:30. Fleur looked at him over her cup. How are you? Ask me something harder. I'm asking you this one. Harry considered it honestly. 5 suppressors removed. 48 remaining. He could feel the difference the 5 made, not dramatically, not as some obvious surge of power, more like the way a room feels when someone opens a window. A circulation. An awareness. Like peripheral vision he hadn't known was blocked until now. It extended slightly further in every direction, and what he was perceiving wasn't more of the world but more of himself within it. Stranger than yesterday, he said. Better than last week. I'll let you know in a month. Fair. She set down her cup. Harry. About my mother, Fleur. I'm not going to be inappropriate about it, I know you're not. I'm going to be direct about it, which is different. She fixed him with the look she'd inherited from Apollon, that calm, level assessment that didn't ask permission. She hasn't looked for a mate. She stopped believing that was something that would happen for her about 10 years ago. She was matter-of-fact about it. She said the dominant bloodline was extinct and she was the queen and that was enough. A pause. She said it often enough that I stopped arguing with her, which is unusual for me. I've noticed. What I'm saying is, she's going to try to be professional about this. She's going to try to treat it like a political situation with a personal dimension, because that's the version she can manage. Fleur's eyes were very direct. Don't let her. Harry looked at her. Fleur. I have 48 suppressors still running. I barely know what I am yet. I'm not exactly in a position to, I'm not saying now, she said. I'm saying, don't let her build the wall all the way up. She'll try. A slight smile, fond and rueful. She's very good at walls. So am I, Harry said. Yes, Fleur said. That's why I'm talking to you and not her. He held her gaze for a moment and then looked back at the prophet. Okay, he said. Which wasn't a promise, exactly. But Fleur seemed to take it as one, and went back to her coffee. The Ministry of Magic at 8 in the morning was not a place that handled crisis with grace. Harry knew this because he walked into it at 8:15 with Apollon on one side and Vauquelin on the other and Hermione behind him with a folder thick enough to function as a weapon, and what greeted them in the atrium was the specific chaos of an institution that had been expecting a quiet Tuesday and received 14 simultaneous diplomatic declarations instead. Ministry officials moved in tight, vast clusters. A junior auror near the visitor entrance was having what appeared to be a fraught conversation with his radio. Two witches from International Magical Cooperation were power-walking toward the lifts with expressions of women who had not slept and had strong feelings about it. Someone had already pinned a copy of the Prophet to the notice board by the security desk, and around it stood a small group of ministry workers reading it with the communal energy of people watching something terrible happen to someone else. Until Harry walked past and several of them realized it was happening to him, specifically, and went very quiet. Harry kept walking. He was in his own robes today, not the summit dress robes, just his regular ones, dark and simple, and he'd fixed the collar properly because the occasion seemed to demand it and also because Hermione had given him a look. His wand was in his pocket, accessible. He was calm in the way he'd been calm at the graveyard and on the astronomy tower and in the forest at dawn, the calm that wasn't the absence of feeling but the subordination of it to purpose. They took the lift to level 1. The minister's floor. The secretary outside Fudge's office stood up very fast when they came around the corner. She was a competent-looking witch with the energy of someone who had been fielding calls for 2 hours and had developed a specific expression for managing situations she hadn't been trained for. Mr. Potter, she said. I'm afraid the minister is, in his office, Harry said pleasantly. I can hear him. He's been in there since 7, which means he's read the Prophet and he hasn't left yet, which means he's hoping this resolves itself if he sits still long enough. He smiled. It won't. Could you let him know we're here? The secretary looked at Apollon. Something in Apollon's expression resolved the internal debate the secretary was clearly having. She reached for the door. Fudge's office was large and cluttered with the aesthetic of a man who had been in power long enough to accumulate a great deal of self-congratulatory memorabilia. The minister himself was behind his desk and looked, when they entered, like a man who had eaten something that disagreed with him. He was sweating slightly. His lime green bowler hat was on the desk rather than his head, which meant his morning had started badly enough to compromise his trademark. Harry, my boy, he began, and the warmth in it was like watching someone try to light a fire in the rain. Minister, Harry said. You know Apollon Delacour, Queen of the Veela nation. This is Seraphine Vauquelin, the French magical ambassador. And this is Hermione Granger, who has cross-referenced every relevant treaty article and would like to share several of them with you. Hermione placed the folder on Fudge's desk with the precision of someone delivering a verdict. Fudge looked at the folder. Looked at Harry. Looked at Apollon, with the expression of a man trying to decide which of several bad situations to address first. Now, I want to be clear, he said, that Britain takes the diplomatic concerns raised very seriously, and we absolutely intend to review. There is nothing to review, Apollon said. Her voice in a room like this, governmental, institutional, where authority was performed rather than held, was something else. The room seemed to tighten around it, pay attention, arrange itself. Article 17 is unambiguous. The violations are documented and confirmed by my personal examination. The declarations have been filed this morning with the International Magical Tribunal. You are not in a review process, Minister. You are in a response process. Fudge went slightly gray. The tribunal will formally convene within 72 hours, Vauquelin said. He opened a second folder, he always had a second folder, and placed a document before Fudge that had 7 different ministerial seals on it. Britain has been officially notified. This is the notification. Fudge stared at the document like it might be a hallucination. 14 nations, he said, faintly. 14, Apollon confirmed. Over 1, he stopped himself, glanced at Harry, chose different words. Over 1 individual. Over the systematic violation of international treaty protections for that individual, Apollon said. Over the suppression of a creature-bonded marker without consent. Over the deliberate neutralization of Veela's sovereign interests through magical assault on a recognized dominant. She paused. Over the fact that this was not done once in a moment of panic but 53 times over 6 years by a coordinated institutional effort. Another pause. If you'd like to frame it as being about 1 individual, Minister, I'd encourage you to ask yourself how you intend that to read in the tribunal record. Fudge opened his mouth and closed it. He was not, Harry had always thought, a stupid man, just a fearful one, and fear made him perform certainty he didn't have. Right now the fear was so large that even the performance had given up. What does Britain need to do, Fudge said, and the deflation in his voice was almost painful, to demonstrate good faith? 3 things, Harry said. Fudge looked at him, seemingly surprised that Harry was the one answering. 1, Harry said. Full cooperation with the tribunal investigation. Every document, every record, every authorization that touched the suppressor program gets submitted. No redactions. Harry, some of those records involve, every record, Harry said. 2. The suppressors are removed without interference. The ministry issues no countervailing orders, no Wiesengemat injunctions, nothing. The removal process is allowed to proceed at the pace and method that Apollon determines. Fudge's jaw tightened. And 3. Harry looked at him steadily. 3. Dumbledore is formally required to attend the tribunal. Not invited. Required. The silence in the room was total for about 5 seconds. Then Fudge said, "You understand what you're asking, politically." "I understand exactly what I'm asking," Harry said. "Politically and otherwise." Another silence. Fudge looked at the document with its 7 seals. Looked at Apollon, who regarded him with the polite implacability of someone who had more power in this situation than he did, and both of them knew it. Looked at Harry. Harry looked back at him and waited. "I'll need to consult with the Wiesengemat," Fudge said. "Of course," Apollon said. "You have until 5 o'clock today to confirm Britain's cooperative posture. After 5, the tribunal will determine the terms without British input." Fudge picked up his quill. Seemed to realize he had nowhere to direct it. "Put it down." "I'll have an answer by 3, he said, with the resignation of a man who has run the math and didn't enjoy the results. "Appreciated," Harry said, and stood, and they left. The corridor outside Fudge's office was mercifully empty. Vauquelin pulled out his notebook the moment the door closed and began writing, efficiently and with purpose. Hermione retrieved her folder and was already flipping to a new section. Harry stood for a moment and breathed. "Well done," Apollon said quietly, beside him. "He's going to comply," Harry said. "Not because he wants to. Because the alternative is Britain fighting 14 nations in a tribunal without cooperation credit, and he's too politically survival-oriented to let that happen." "Yes." She fell into step beside him as they moved back toward the lifts. "He will also attempt to privately contact Dumbledore before 3 o'clock. "I know. Does it matter?" "Less than he thinks." She was quiet for a moment. Dumbledore cannot undo the declarations. He cannot recall the tribunal notice. Whatever he and Fudge discuss this afternoon will be damage management, not prevention. The lift arrived. They stepped in, and the moment the doors closed, Hermione said, "Harry," with the specific energy of someone who has been holding a question for 20 minutes and cannot hold it one more second. "Go ahead," he said. "The tribunal. The 72 hours." She was looking at her notes. "That's a very short window for the suppressor removal process. We have 48 left and we've established the deeper ones take significantly longer. If the tribunal convenes before you're fully, I don't need to be fully free before the tribunal," Harry said. "I need to be free enough." "What does that mean?" "I'll know when I get there." Hermione looked at him with the expression of someone who fundamentally disagreed with this approach and was choosing to file it for later. "Fine," she said. "But I'm tracking the pace. I'd expect nothing less." The lift opened on the atrium. They walked through it and the noise of the ministry swirled around them, more voices now, more urgency, the building reorganizing around the news of the morning the way water reorganizes around a dropped stone, and Harry moved through it all and felt, very distantly through the remaining suppressors, something that was, he reached for the word, impatient. Not his emotions. His magic. Impatient, the way water behind a dam is impatient. Not destructive. Just present, and aware, and done with waiting. Soon, he thought at it, which was a strange thing to think at yourself. It settled, marginally. They were halfway back to the embassy when the second thing happened. Harry felt it before he saw it, a shift in the ambient magic of the street, the particular quality of attention that meant someone was watching with intent rather than curiosity. He said, "Stop," quietly, and everyone stopped, and 3 seconds later a man in ministry robes stepped out of an apparition 20 feet ahead of them. Not a threat. Harry registered that immediately, no wand drawn, body language contained. Late 30s, dark-skinned, precise features, wearing the robes of the Department of Magical Law Enforcement. He had the bearing of someone who had chosen this moment carefully and was prepared for multiple outcomes. "Mr. Potter," he said. "My name is Marcus Thrace. Deputy head of the DMLE. He looked at Apollon briefly. "Your Majesty." Then back to Harry. "I'd like to speak with you privately." "No," Harry said. "Not unkindly. Whatever you need to say it here." Thrace assessed this and accepted it without negotiation. "Amelia Bones sent me." Harry's interest sharpened. Amelia Bones was the head of the DMLE, one of the few people in the ministry with both genuine authority and a reputation for intellectual honesty. She'd been notably absent from the morning's chaos. "Why didn't she come herself?" Harry said. "She didn't want it to look official," Thrace said. "Not yet." He reached into his robes and produced a sealed letter, held it out. "She'd like to meet. Separately from the tribunal process. She says to tell you, she says, I've known about this for 11 months. I want you to know what I did when I found out and why it wasn't enough." The street was quiet around them. Harry looked at the letter. She knew. She uncovered a partial record, Thrace said carefully. She took it to Dumbledore. He told her, he provided her with context that she accepted, at the time, as sufficient. His voice was very even, the evenness of a professional delivering information he finds personally uncomfortable. She no longer finds it sufficient. Harry took the letter. Broke the seal. "Read it." Amelia Bones's handwriting was precise and angular, the handwriting of someone who thought in documents. "Mr. Potter, I am not asking for absolution. I am asking for the opportunity to be useful. I have records that are not in the institutional archive. They are in my personal safe and they are yours if you want them. I can also give you 4 Wisengamot votes that Fudge does not know I have. I am not a good person in this story. But I can still be a useful one. A. Bones." He handed it to Apollon without comment. She read it. Handed it back. Tell her yes, Harry said to Thrace. Tomorrow morning. At the embassy. He paused. And tell her to bring the records. Thrace nodded. She'll be there. He started to turn, then stopped. For what it's worth, Mr. Potter, there are more of us in the building than you might expect. He looked at Harry with something that wasn't quite guilt and wasn't quite resolution. Who didn't know, or who knew pieces, or who asked questions we were told were above our pay grade. He paused. We've been reading the Prophet this morning. Good, Harry said. Keep reading. Thrace operat. The space he'd left behind felt briefly charged, like the air after lightning. For Wisengamot votes, Hermione said, already calculating. She'll have more, Harry said. The letter's the opening position. She's testing how we respond before she shows the whole hand. Smart, Apollon said. She's very smart, Harry said. She's the most competent person in that building. Which is exactly why it matters that she accepted Dumbledore's explanation for 11 months. He folded the letter and pocketed it. It tells you something about how convincing he is. They walked the rest of the way to the embassy in comfortable silence, the kind that doesn't need to be filled. The Wisengamot convened an emergency session at 1 o'clock, which Harry knew because Hermione had sources in the ministry's administrative staff that she had spent 5 years cultivating and never wasted. He was not there. He was in the embassy's warded sitting room with Apollon, working on the next suppressor, the 7th, which had been integrated so deeply into the tissue of his magic that it took Apollon 2 full hours to isolate without disturbing the surrounding structure. Harry sat very still through it and focused on his breathing and occasionally on the tapestry on the opposite wall, which depicted a Veela ceremony he didn't have the cultural context for but which was intricate and absorbing enough to anchor his attention through the progressively uncomfortable pressure of the work. The Wisengamot, Apollon said, not breaking her concentration. She was reading him the way a physician reads a patient, the information present in what she was touching rather than what he was saying. You're thinking about it. Thinking about what they're deciding. They are deciding whether to comply with Fudge's recommendation or whether to mount a political challenge, she said, the way you'd say something obvious. They will comply. The votes aren't there for a challenge. Dumbledore has votes. Not 14 nations worth. A pause. A delicate push against the suppressor, a tightening of her magic around it. Also, Dumbledore does not want a political challenge right now. He wants time. He wants to find the version of this that he can shape. He won't find it. No, she agreed. But he'll try, and the trying will keep him from doing anything precipitous. She pressed harder and Harry winced despite himself. Sorry. It's fine. It's not fine, but it will be brief. True to her word, the suppressor cracked 15 seconds later with the particular sensation of something deeply personal being removed. The 7th one had been keyed specifically to his Veela dominant response. Harry could feel it in retrospect. It had specifically muted the part of him that would have reached back toward the Veela magical frequency. Without it, the warmth of Apollon's proximity was more pronounced. He was aware of it the way you're aware of a fire when you've been cold. He didn't mention this. She didn't mention it either. 7, she said. 46 to go. We'll do 2 more tonight, she said. The sequencing matters. We can't simply remove them in order, some of the older ones are linked, and removing one without first freeing the adjacent network will, cause the building to brace itself. Yes, you mentioned. I was understating earlier, she said, and he looked at her. How much were you understating? The 2 deepest suppressors, she said, meeting his gaze with the directness that he'd already learned was her default register for important things, were designed to cap your core magical output. They are not mate suppressors, strictly speaking, they are power limiters. Added to the suppressor structure, I believe, because someone realized that a fully operational dominant would have enough ambient magical force to break the mate suppressors through sheer pressure. Harry stared at her. They knew the mate suppressors alone wouldn't hold. They added 2 power limiters to hold the mate suppressors in place, she said. Yes. So my actual, he stopped. How much have I been operating at? Apollon was quiet for exactly 1 second. My best estimate, based on what I have felt so far, between 30 and 40%. The room was silent. Of my actual capacity, Harry said, making sure he had this right. 30 to 40%. Possibly less, in the early years. The first suppressors went on when you were 11. You've been developing magically against them, which is like building muscle while someone tightens the tourniquet. You've become extraordinarily capable at 30%. She looked at him. I am trying to prepare you for what removing the final 2 will feel like. Harry looked at his hands. Thought about the graveyard, 3rd year, the DA, every duel, every impossible thing he'd managed. All of it at 1/3 of himself. He wasn't angry. That was the strange part. He'd expected to feel it like a wave and it hadn't come. Instead there was something steadier, something that sat in his chest and burned low and clean like a properly laid fire. All right, he said. Tell me the order. Which ones before we get to those 2? She produced a piece of parchment she'd been working from, a diagram of the 53 suppressor network, each one numbered in her handwriting, with small notations in French that he couldn't read. She'd drawn the 2 power limiters in a different color. Red. They were at the center of the diagram like the load-bearing pillars of a building. We work inward, she said. Every suppressor that connects to the outer network, first. By the time we reach the inner ring, the ones adjacent to the limiters, you should be operating at roughly 70%. She traced the diagram with 1 finger. At that point the final removal will be manageable. Not comfortable. Manageable. Harry studied the diagram. How long? Done carefully. She considered. 3 days. Perhaps 4. We have 72 hours until the tribunal. She looked at him. I know. We need to be at the tribunal. I know. So we do it in 2.5 days, he said. Can that be done? She looked at the diagram. If we work longer sessions. If you can tolerate the pace. I can tolerate a lot, Harry said. Not boasting. Just established fact, based on evidence. Apollon looked at him. The fire in the room was the only sound. 2.5 days, she said. We start the evening sessions tonight. Good. He looked at the diagram. At the red pillars at the center. I want them all off before I walk into that tribunal room. Then we'll get them all off. Ron found him on the embassy's rear terrace at 6 that evening, which looked out on an impossibly well-maintained garden that was doing something subtly French with its geometry. Harry was sitting on the stone railing, feet dangling, eating a piece of bread he'd taken from the kitchen with the energy of someone who has spent 6 hours doing something strenuous and needs fuel more than company but will accept both. Hermione's been in with Vauquelin for 2 hours, Ron said, dropping onto the railing beside him. They're building the tribunal presentation. I know. She's in her element. A pause. Genuinely. I don't think I've seen her this happy since OWL preparation. He took the bread, tore off a piece, handed the rest back. Wisengamot voted to comply, by the way. She got the news 20 minutes ago. Fudge's confirmation is already at the embassy. I expected that. Harry. Ron's voice shifted to the register that meant he was about to say something he'd been sitting on. 7 suppressors gone. 46 left. You doing okay? You asked me that last night. Asking again. Things have moved. Harry ate the bread. Looked at the garden. My magic, he said, feels like a river that someone's been building channels in for 6 years. Every time one comes off, the channels don't immediately fill, it takes a few hours for the flow to even out. He paused. But each time it does, I feel, more like myself. Except I don't know what myself is yet. I know more of what I'm not. What aren't you? Small, Harry said. I'm definitely not small. Ron was quiet. Then, no. You never were. He looked sideways. She's good at this, isn't she? Apollon. She's extraordinary at this, Harry said. It's not just the technical skill. She does it like she knows it matters. Not strategically. She's not thinking about the tribunal when she's working. She's just, he stopped. Just what? Careful, he said, after a moment. She's extraordinarily careful with it. With me. He heard himself and added, with the process. Right, Ron said. Don't. I didn't say anything. Your face said several things. My face is a private document. Ron hopped off the railing. I'm going to go find food that isn't bread. Coming. Harry slid off the railing. Yeah. He looked once more at the garden, the perfect French geometry of it. Ron. Yeah. Thank you for being here. You and Hermione. You didn't have to, this became something a lot bigger than, Harry, Ron said, with the tone of someone who has heard this specific category of sentiment enough times to have a standing policy. We're here. Stop thanking us. It's weird. Harry smiled. All right. All right. Ron held the terrace door open. Let's go find something to eat before Hermione emerges from the document room and informs us that she's solved international magical law. She might have. She definitely has, Ron said. That's what concerns me. That night they did 2 more. The 8th came off in 40 minutes, clean and almost gentle. The 9th fought, old, deeply layered, a suppressor that had been added in Harry's second year with a specificity that told Apollon something about when whoever had done it at first suspected what he was. When it finally released, Harry's magic moved through the room like weather, and every sconce on the walls went simultaneously dark and then simultaneously bright, and Fleur, who had been watching from the doorway, said something in rapid French that sounded either like a prayer or profanity. 9 down. 44 to go. Harry sat in the chair afterward, eyes closed, feeling the new space. The new self. Another increment of what had always been there, waiting. He heard Apollon sit down across from him. He didn't open his eyes. What does it feel like, she said. Right now. He thought about it honestly. Like being handed back something that belonged to me that I'd never actually held. A pause. Yes, she said quietly. That's a good description. He opened his eyes. She was watching him with the expression she got when she'd stopped performing composure, the real one, unguarded, that he was starting to be able to read. There was something in it that Fleur had warned him she'd build a wall over if given the chance. He decided not to give her the chance. Fleur told me you stopped believing the dominant story was yours, he said. 10 years ago. She stilled. Just slightly. Fleur talks a great deal. She loves you, Harry said. She talks because she wants things to go right for you. He held her gaze. I'm not going to pretend the bond isn't there. I felt it the first time you touched that suppressor. I think you felt it longer than I have. You have 44 suppressors still in place, she said. You don't know the full weight of it yet. No, he agreed. But I know enough. He leaned forward slightly. I'm not asking you to make any decisions. I'm asking you to stop deciding against it before you know what it is. She looked at him for a long moment. The fire was low. The room was quiet. Somewhere in the embassy, they could hear Hermione's voice through the wall, still working, still compiling. You are 17, Apollon said. Not unkindly. I'm aware. I am 41. Also aware. And you are not, she stopped. Started again. You are not just a young man. You are a political event. The dominant marker, the tribunal, the declarations, everything is already in motion. I cannot, she stopped again. You can't tell, Harry said, whether what you feel is the bond responding or actually wanting it yourself. She looked at him. Something in her expression shifted. No, she said. I can't. Then we find out, he said. After. When the chains are off and the tribunal is done and it's just you and me with no politics around it. We find out what it actually is. He paused. That's all I'm saying. The silence extended. She held his gaze with those not entirely human eyes, and whatever she was deciding, she decided it without drama, without performance. After, she said. After, he agreed. He stood, stretched, felt 44 suppressors do their diminishing work against the space of him. 3 days. 44 to go. And somewhere in the ministry, Cornelius Fudge was drafting his compliance notice, and Dumbledore was sitting in his office with Fawkes and the ruins of a plan 20 years in the making, and 14 nations were watching to see what came next. Harry went to bed and slept like someone who had made up his mind. Outside, Britain moved through what would later be described, in history books, in treaty analyses, in Hermione Granger's extraordinarily detailed personal account that would eventually be published to considerable controversy, as the last quiet night before everything changed. It wasn't quiet, of course. Nothing was quiet. But it was the last night in which the change was still only a promise. By morning, it would be a fact. Chapter 4. The weight of 70%. Amelia Bones arrived at the embassy at 8 in the morning with a leather satchel, no assistant, and the expression of a woman who had made a decision she wasn't going to unmake regardless of how uncomfortable the next hour turned out to be. Harry met her in the entrance hall. Just him. He'd asked Apollon and the others to give him the first 10 minutes alone with her, which had prompted a look from Apollon that communicated both respect for the instinct and a precise awareness of why he'd made it. She'd nodded and gone back to the communications room, where Vauquelin had been running on 4 hours of sleep and what appeared to be an unlimited supply of strong French coffee. Bones was a solidly built witch in her mid-50s, square-jawed, silver-haired, with eyes that assessed rooms the way architects assess buildings, structurally, looking for what held things up and what might fail. She looked at Harry and did not offer him the sympathetic expression that most adults deployed when they were about to apologize to him. She just looked at him directly and said, "You're taller than I expected." "People say that," Harry said. "They also say you're quiet. They mean it as a diminishment." "I don't think it is." "It isn't," Harry said. "Come in." They sat in a small room off the entrance hall, not the main warded sitting room, which felt too formal for this, but a quieter space with 2 armchairs and a window. Harry poured tea from the pot that had materialized on the side table, which the embassy seemed to produce reflexively whenever someone sat down in it, and waited. Bones put the satchel on the table and opened it and removed a stack of files that had the particular worn quality of documents that had been taken out and put back many times. She placed them between them without preamble. 11 months ago, she said, a routine audit of the Department for Regulation and Control of Magical Creatures flagged an anomalous expenditure. Authorization of a classified binding material, highly specific, restricted to creature-related applications. The authorization went back 6 years. The recipient was not listed. She tapped the top file. I pursued it. I found 4 suppressor purchase records before the trail was redirected into an authorization code that required Wisengamot-level clearance to access. And you went to Dumbledore, Harry said. I went to Dumbledore, she confirmed, without flinching. He told me, and I want you to hear the exact words, because they were chosen with precision, he told me that the binding materials had been used in connection with your magical development, with your knowledge and consent, as a precautionary measure connected to the Voldemort situation. She looked at Harry steadily. He was specific enough to sound credible. He was vague enough to be technically unverifiable. And she stopped. You accepted it, Harry said. I chose to accept it, she said. The distinction mattered to her, clearly. She wasn't offering him the version where she'd been deceived into innocence. I had concerns. I set them aside because Dumbledore said it was necessary, and I had learned, over 30 years of working in this building, that when Albus Dumbledore said something was necessary he was usually right. Usually, Harry said. Not this time. She met his eyes. Not even close. Harry picked up the top file and opened it. The expenditure records were meticulous: dates, amounts, authorization signatures. He recognized 2 of the signatures. One was from the DRCMC, which he'd expected. One was from the International Magical Cooperative, which was new. The cooperative, he said. 3 of the European ministries coordinated the purchase of the more specialized materials through the cooperative's discretionary fund, Bones said. It made the authorization trail harder to follow. Different jurisdictions, different audit thresholds. A pause. Someone who understood international magical bureaucracy very well designed the paper trail. Dumbledore spent 30 years on international magical committees, Harry said. Yes, Bones said. He did. Harry closed the file. He thought about being 11 years old and Gringotts and Ollivanders and the feeling of stepping into a world that had been waiting for him, and the tall old man who had guided every step of that entry with such deliberate, loving care. He thought about every time Dumbledore had positioned himself between Harry and a question Harry wanted answered. Every deflection dressed as wisdom. Every delay packaged as protection. He thought about all of it and felt clear. Not okay. Clear. The difference being that clarity was useful and okay could wait. The 4 votes you mentioned, he said. Bones nodded. I've spoken privately with 4 Wizengamot members who were not informed about the suppressor program. They were told it was a standard creature classification precaution and signed the broad authorization without understanding what they were authorizing. When I explained the specifics this morning, she paused, 2 were horrified. 1 was angry. 1 asked for 3 hours to verify before committing. The 3 hours are up. She checked her watch. 40 minutes ago. And? All 4 are yours, she said. Plus myself, in whatever capacity is useful. Harry looked at her. This was the thing about Amelia Bones that made her different from the other institutional players in this situation: she wasn't maneuvering for a favorable outcome for herself. She was too senior and too established to need it, and too honest to want it. She was here because 11 months ago she'd made a decision she now found indefensible, and the only thing she knew how to do about it was be useful. Can you get into the Wizengamot Authorization Archive? He said. The restricted section. She blinked. Technically, yes. I have the clearance. I haven't, she stopped. You want the full record. Every authorization that touched the suppressor program. Every vote, every signature, everyone who knew. He held her gaze. The tribunal is going to want a complete picture. I'd rather build it ourselves before their investigators do, so we know what's in it. If I pull those records, she said carefully, I am committing to a position that will be visible. I know, Harry said. I'm not asking you to fall on a sword. I'm asking whether you're willing to stand somewhere publicly. She looked at the files between them. Looked at Harry. I spent 11 months telling myself that trusting Dumbledore's judgment was reasonable, she said. I am done being reasonable in ways that require me to look away. Then yes. Harry said. Then yes, she said. I'll have the archive records within 4 hours. They shook hands. It felt like the right gesture, not warm exactly, but solid. The handshake of 2 people who have each decided something and intend to follow through. By the time Apollon started the morning session at 10, Harry had briefed everyone in the main sitting room on Bones's visit, and Hermione had added 4 new sections to the tribunal presentation folder in the time it took him to drink a cup of tea. Vauquelin had emailed, or the magical equivalent, 3 of the 14 coalition ambassadors with the new information, and 2 had already responded with updated documentation. The morning session was harder than any before it. Apollon worked through 4 suppressors in 3.5 hours, and the difficulty escalated with each one, not linearly but exponentially, the way cold increases when you go deep underwater rather than simply further from shore. The 10th came off with a sound like a snapped cord that was audible to everyone in the room. The 11th took 45 minutes and left Harry's hands visibly trembling until Apollon pressed them flat against the chair arms and held them there for 30 seconds with an expression of pure clinical focus that he found, in the moment, more steadying than sympathy would have been. The 12th and 13th were linked. Apollon had mapped this in her diagram, and she worked them simultaneously, which required a level of concentration that rendered the room genuinely silent for 22 minutes. Even Hermione stopped writing. Even Ron, who fidgeted through everything, went still. When they finally broke, the effect was immediate and enormous. Harry stood up. He didn't mean to. His body simply decided that standing was correct and followed through before his mind caught up. He stood and the room filled with something, not light, not sound, not a pressure wave, but a presence that was difficult to describe except that everyone in the room felt it the way you feel weather. Fleur's hand went to the doorframe. Ron stepped back half a step. Hermione's quill scratched an involuntary mark across her parchment. Apollon stood her ground, 3 feet away, and her eyes were very wide. Harry breathed. In, out. The presence contracted, or rather, he gathered it, the way you gather yourself after a start, pulling the scattered parts back to center. It took a moment. The room came back to its normal dimensions. Sorry, he said. Don't apologize, Fleur said, from the doorway, with the intensity of someone making a point. Don't ever apologize for that. How many is that? Ron said. His voice was steady, which Harry appreciated. 13, Hermione said, and her voice was slightly different than usual, not afraid, but recalibrated. 40 to go. 40 remaining suppressors, and the room had just responded to 13 being gone like that. Apollon crossed to him, studied him with the diagnostic precision she'd been applying all morning. What does it feel like, she said, which had become her standard question after each session, a clinical checkpoint. Like, Harry reached for it. Like a frequency I can almost hear. Like the edge of a sound. Whatever I am, it's close. I can feel how close it is. She nodded. We're approaching the inner ring. She looked at her diagram. The next 4, 15 through 18, are the last of the outer network. After those, we're into the middle layer. Then let's do them today, Harry said. Harry, Hermione started. Not all 4 today, Apollon said, simultaneously. They looked at each other briefly. 2 more today. Tonight you rest. Tomorrow morning we do the middle layer. The timeline requires you functional, she said firmly. Pushing the pace past this point without recovery intervals will not accelerate the removal, it will destabilize the structure. Which takes longer to repair than a night's sleep takes. Harry looked at her. The frequency under his skin pulsed once, that not quite sound, impatient. 2 more today, he said. But we start again early tomorrow. 5 o'clock, she said. 4:30, he said. She looked at him with the flat expression of someone declining to negotiate with a sunrise. 5, she said. Deal. The 2 nations he hadn't expected were Bulgaria and Ireland. Hermione brought him the news at 2 in the afternoon. He was sitting in the embassy library, not reading, just sitting in the particular way of someone whose body needs stillness because everything inside it is moving, and she had the expression of someone delivering information that changes the shape of a situation. Bulgaria's formal declaration came through an hour ago, she said, settling into the chair across from him. And Ireland filed 30 minutes after. Harry looked up. Bulgaria I understand, Victor and the Veela Alliance networks. But Ireland? The Irish Magical Assembly has had a running dispute with the British Ministry about cross-border creature rights jurisdiction for 8 years, Hermione said. specifically about Veela rights of movement. She put her notes on the table. This gave them standing they'd been looking for. But Harry, it's not just those two. She hesitated. What else? 3 of the original 14 are fragmenting. She picked her words carefully. Luxembourg and the Netherlands have issued joint statements saying they support the declaration in principle but have concerns about the tribunal's jurisdiction extending to, and I'm quoting, the internal governance decisions of sovereign magical nations, even in cases where those decisions affect bonded individuals. Harry absorbed this. They're worried about precedent. Specifically, they're worried that if the tribunal rules Britain's suppressor program is an international violation, it sets a precedent that could be used to challenge other nations' domestic magical legislation. Because they have domestic magical legislation they don't want challenged. Yes. Hermione looked uncomfortable. Luxembourg has a classified creature registration program. The Netherlands has restrictions on Veela right of habitation in certain districts. They joined the coalition because of Harry, specifically, and the Veela treaty standing. But they don't want the principle to extend. Harry leaned back. So 2 of the 14 are already trying to narrow the scope. And a third, Portugal, has gone quiet entirely. They filed the declaration, they're not retracting it, but they haven't responded to any of Vauquelin's communications in 6 hours. He thought about this. He thought about what Apollon had said about 14 nations, about how some had joined because of him and some because of the treaty and some because they'd been waiting for an excuse. The fractures were showing. Which he'd expected, he just hadn't expected them this early. What does this do to the tribunal? He asked. Nothing, immediately. The declarations stand regardless of the secondary political positioning. The tribunal will convene. Hermione folded her hands on the table. But if Luxembourg and the Netherlands start lobbying other coalition members for a narrowed ruling scope, it could affect the remedies the tribunal awards. Meaning they could rule the suppression was illegal but limit what they can actually demand Britain do about it. In theory. She paused. Harry, there are people in this coalition who want to use you to establish precedent that benefits them. Not because they care about what was done to you. I know, he said. Does that make me angry? No. He thought about it. Not really. People use things for their own ends. That's just true. What matters is whether the tribunal rules correctly about what happened and what needs to happen now. He looked at her. I can be useful to people's agendas and still get what I need. Those aren't mutually exclusive. Hermione studied him. You've gotten very good at political thinking. I've been living in political situations since I was 11, he said. I just didn't have the vocabulary for it. He paused. That's one more thing the suppressors took, by the way. Vocabulary. What do you mean? I always knew there was something I wasn't understanding about the way people responded to me. About the way rooms changed when I walked in, or the way Dumbledore always positioned himself so carefully around my choices. He looked at the window. I thought it was just, the boy who lived thing. Being a symbol. Turns out it was also the fact that I was radiating something through 53 locks that people could feel but couldn't identify, and everyone found a different way to respond to it. He paused. Dumbledore found a way to contain it. Hermione was quiet for a moment. I felt it, she said. I never told you because I didn't know what it was. But from the first time I sat next to you in Charms, there was something. Not like Veela compulsion, nothing that affected my thinking. Just the sense that I was near something important. That it mattered to be near you. Is that why you stayed? He said. Through everything. I stayed because you're my best friend and I love you, Harry, and honestly this is becoming a sentimental conversation that I didn't plan for. She stood up, gathering her notes with the efficiency of someone managing their own emotions. The point is, Vauquelin needs to know about Luxembourg and the Netherlands before the afternoon diplomatic window closes. Apollon should be aware. Tell them, Harry said. And Hermione, she stopped. Thank you, he said. For the love thing. You don't say it much. I say it all the time, she said. You don't listen. She left. Harry sat for another 10 minutes in the library, in the particular silence of a room full of books, and felt the 13 freed places in his magic move like opened windows. Then he went to find Apollon. He found her on the terrace with Vauquelin and a rolled map that turned out to be a visual representation of the coalition structure, nation by nation, connection by connection, the diplomatic web that had formed in 48 hours. She was explaining something to Vauquelin in French, pointing at Portugal's position on the map with one finger, and she looked up when Harry came through the terrace door with the expression of someone who had been expecting him. He told her about Luxembourg and the Netherlands. She listened without interrupting, which he'd learned was her most attentive mode, the absence of interjection rather than its presence. Portugal, she said, when he'd finished. Silent, he confirmed. 6 hours. She looked at the map. Portugal's minister owes a political debt to the Flemish magical district, which borders Luxembourg and has historically aligned with their creature legislation. She tapped Portugal's position. He's waiting to see which way the wind blows before committing to a coalition position. Can we move him? Potentially. She looked at Vauquelin. Get Ambassador Delgado on the communication channel before 3. Don't reference Luxembourg, reference the Covenant directly, and the Veela High Council's formal position. She looked back at Harry. Delgado respects institutional authority. If the High Council speaks formally through me rather than through the coalition, he'll find it easier to hold. How many of the 14 are actually solid? Harry asked. She was quiet for a moment, running the calculation. 10, she said. Perhaps 11. France, obviously. The 4 Veela allied nations without internal complications. Bulgaria and Ireland are new but committed. Spain is solid, a slight pause. Greece I have concerns about. Greece, Vauquelin said, already writing. Greece has a shipping magnate with significant political leverage who has been lobbying for reduced Veela territorial rights in Mediterranean ports for 3 years, Apollon said. He'll be making calls tonight. She looked at Harry. This is the part one need you to understand about the coalition. 10 nations with genuine, stable commitment to the declaration is still 10 nations. The tribunal convenes regardless. The ruling stands regardless. But the remedies, Harry said. The remedies, she confirmed. The breadth of what the tribunal can demand from Britain depends partly on coalition solidarity. She held his gaze. I want to be honest with you about this. 10 nations gets us a ruling and a set of remedies. 14 gets us transformation. Harry looked at the map. He thought about what transformation meant, in this context, not just for him, not just the suppressor removal and the tribunal, but for the structure of international magical creature law. For what a ruling at 14 nation solidarity would mean as precedent for Veela rights, for creature-bonded individuals, for the dozens of people across the magical world who were in situations the law hadn't adequately addressed. He thought about Hermione's face when she talked about the Dutch habitation restrictions. I want to talk to the Luxembourg ambassador, he said. Apollon blinked. Just once. That's not typical procedure. I know. But the Luxembourg position is about precedent anxiety, right? They're worried about what a broad ruling means for their own domestic legislation. He looked at her. Let me talk to their ambassador. Not about the coalition or the tribunal scope. Just, let me talk to them. What would you say? Vauquelin said carefully, the carefulness of someone who was aware that Harry talking to ambassadors could go several directions. The truth, Harry said. That what was done to me isn't a technicality or a treaty gray area. That it was years of deliberate, institutional harm to a person who couldn't consent. That the question of whether Luxembourg's creature registration program constitutes a similar harm is a separate question that deserves its own conversation, but that refusing to call my situation wrong because of anxiety about that conversation is exactly the kind of thinking that lets institutions keep doing harm. He paused. I'm not threatening them. I'm asking them to be honest with themselves about which side of this they want to be on. Apollon looked at him for a long moment. Then she looked at Vauquelin. Something passed between them, the shorthand of a long professional relationship. I'll arrange the call for 5 o'clock, Vauquelin said, and went inside. Apollon turned back to Harry. The afternoon light was doing something complicated with her hair and the silver gold of it was absurdly distracting, so he looked at the map instead. You understand, she said, that you are doing politics. I know. You don't seem to mind it. I mind it less than pretending politics isn't happening, he said. The latter gets people killed. I've noticed. She made the small sound she made when he'd said something she hadn't expected and found at apartment. Not quite a laugh. More like an acknowledgement that arrived through the wrong door. 14 nations, she said. Let's see. The Luxembourg call was at 5. Harry sat across from a magical communication crystal in the embassy's private communication room, and across it materialized the face of Ambassador Elise Vander, who was in her 60s, sharp-eyed, with the manner of a woman who had spent 40 years being underestimated and had stopped being polite about it 20 years in. She looked at Harry with an assessment that reminded him, somewhat, of Apollon, direct, structural, looking for what held things up. Mr. Potter, she said, in precise English. I expected the Veela Queen. She'll speak with you after, if you'd like, Harry said. I asked to go first. Vander raised an eyebrow. Unusual. I'm told that frequently. He leaned forward. Ambassador, I know why Luxembourg is reconsidering the scope. I'm not going to pretend the precedent concern isn't real. A broad tribunal ruling does create new international standards. She studied him. You're not here to tell me the concern is unfounded. No, he said. The concern is completely founded. A ruling that my situation constitutes a treaty violation sets a standard. That standard will be applied elsewhere. He paused. My question is whether the standard is wrong. The standard has implications, for Luxembourg's creature registration program, Harry said. Yes. I know what it is. I know what the implications are. He held her gaze. Ambassador. I had 53 suppressors put on me before I was 17 years old. Some of them before I was 12. I wasn't asked. I wasn't informed. I was managed, by people who had decided that what I was made me too dangerous to be permitted to be it. He let that sit for a moment. If Luxembourg's registration program does similar things to creatures who haven't consented to registration, if it limits their identity, their agency, their natural magical expression, then the question of whether it should be challenged is a good question. And the discomfort of that question isn't a reason to stop a tribunal from ruling correctly about my case. Silence on the other end. You're asking me, Vander said slowly, to vote my conscience rather than my position. I'm asking you to know the difference between them, Harry said. That's all. A long pause. I'll need to consult with my minister, she said finally, and there was something in her voice that hadn't been there at the start, a quality of internal reckoning that sounded genuine. Of course, Harry said. Thank you for the conversation. Mr. Potter. She stopped him before the crystal dimmed. For what it's worth, I'm sorry. What was done to you is indefensible. Whatever position Luxembourg takes on coalition scope, I want you to know that I personally, she stopped. Collected herself. I'm sorry. Thank you, Harry said, and meant it simply. No performance of graciousness, no managing the moment. Just meant it. The crystal went dark. He sat back. Apollon, who had been standing in the doorway throughout the conversation, came in and sat across from him. She didn't say well done or impressive or any of the things people said when they'd watched you do something effectively. She just sat and looked at him with the expression that kept appearing when she'd stopped deciding what to think and was just thinking. She might hold, she said. She might, he agreed. And if she does, the Netherlands will follow. They defer to Luxembourg on covenant matters. She paused. And Portugal watches the Netherlands. 14, Harry said. Perhaps. She didn't commit to it, which he respected. We'll know by morning. He looked at her. The day had been long and the sessions had been hard, and he had 13 suppressors removed and 40 remaining in a tribunal in less than 48 hours, and he was simultaneously the most tired he could remember being and the most present. The most there. The most him. Let's do the last 2 for today, he said. Harry, I know. Recovery. But I can feel where we are in the sequence. 14 and 15 are outer network, they'll come off easier than what we did this morning. He met her eyes. 40 remaining feels different than 42. Every one matters. She looked at him. Did the thing where she was deciding something. Then, fine. 14 and 15. Then you eat a full meal and sleep 8 hours. 7, he said. 8, she said. Not a negotiation. A prescription. 8, he agreed. They went back to the sitting room. The others filtered in, Ron with food already in hand, Hermione with her folder, Fleur from somewhere in the embassy where she'd apparently been working the phones with Vauquelin's assistant on the Greek situation. Harry sat in a chair. Apollon stood before him. He breathed out, found the floor with his feet, found the chair with his hands. 14. She pressed her palm against his sternum and the warmth of her came through like sunlight through glass, and the 40 remaining suppressors did what they always did, strained against it, tightened against it. He felt them the way you feel the walls of a small room. But the room was bigger than yesterday. Measurably, demonstrably bigger. 14 came off in 20 minutes. 15 took 45. It was old, 6th year, added after the Department of Mysteries, after everything that had happened in that hall, and it had the quality of something added in haste and then reinforced in the months that followed. When it finally cracked, the fire went out entirely and the room was dark for 3 seconds before the sconces reignited, and Harry felt what had been muted for 2 years come flooding back, a roar, a frequency, something that was absolutely and entirely himself. He sat with it. Let it settle. Found its edges. 15, he said into the quiet room. 38 to go, Hermione said, and her voice was entirely steady, and he loved her for it. 38, Ron echoed. He was looking at Harry the way he'd looked at Harry in 2nd year when it was just the 2 of them going down through the trap door, the particular look of someone who was scared and wasn't going to let it be the thing that mattered. You're at, what now? 50%. More, Apollon said. 55, perhaps. The frequency suppressors were disproportionately heavy. Losing 15 means he's recovering the deeper resonance, not just the surface capacity. She was looking at Harry with that open expression, the one she stopped managing around. How does it feel? Harry thought about how to say it. He thought about the word enormous and decided it was too much and too small simultaneously. He thought about terrifying and discarded it because it wasn't fear, it was something much closer to awe, specifically the variety of awe that is directed inward, at the discovery of how much more you are than anyone thought to tell you. Like I've been breathing through a straw for 6 years, he said, and someone just handed me a window. The room was quiet. Then Fleur said, 38 more windows to go, and somehow that was exactly the right thing, because it made Ron laugh, which made Hermione crack, which made the weight of the day lift just enough to be bearable. Harry ate the full meal. He even let Apollon have the 8 hours without negotiating. He dreamed of open water, which he'd never done before. No storm. No drowning. Just the surface of something enormous and the feeling of being equal to it. He woke at 4:50 and lay in the dark for 10 minutes, feeling 38 locks and knowing, with a certainty that had nothing theatrical about it, that by the time he walked into the tribunal, they would all be gone. Every last one. He got up. Put on his robes. Went to find Apollon, who was already in the sitting room with tea and her diagram, her hair loose, her expression the particular one that said she'd been awake for an hour already and had made her peace with it. She looked up when he came in. 4:55, she said. Close enough, Harry said, and sat down. She almost smiled. Almost. Then she pressed her hand to his sternum and they went back to work. Chapter 5, What Dumbledore Built Luxembourg held. Vauquelin confirmed it at 6:15 in the morning, appearing in the sitting room doorway with a communication scroll and the expression of a man who had learned to keep his victories small and his verifications thorough. The Netherlands had followed within the hour, and Portugal, apparently deciding that 6 hours of silence had been sufficient statement-making, filed a reaffirming communication before breakfast. 14 nations. Solid. Harry received the news in the middle of a suppressor removal and nodded once, which was all the response the moment permitted. Apollon was working through the 17th, which sat at the junction of two magical networks in a way that required total concentration from both of them, her for the extraction, him for keeping the surrounding structure stable while she worked. He'd learned to do this over the past day, the way you learn any skill under pressure, imperfectly at first, then adequately, then with a competence that surprised even the teacher. When the 17th came free, it did so quietly. Almost gently. Which Apollon said was a bad sign. The quiet ones, she said, sitting back and studying him, are the ones that were most fully integrated. Your magic treated them as structural. It stopped fighting them. Meaning what for the removal? Meaning the remaining ones in this layer will behave similarly. They'll come off without the theater. But you'll feel them more afterward, not less. The body notices the absence of something it had accepted as part of itself. Harry understood this better than she probably intended him to. He'd spent years accepting the absence of things he couldn't name. Like losing a limp you've had so long you stopped noticing it changes how you walk, he said. She considered this. Yes. Exactly that. So I'll walk differently, he said. Good. She looked at him for a moment with the expression he'd started cataloging, the one where something moved behind her eyes that she'd decided not to name yet. Then she turned back to the diagram. 3 more in this layer, she said. Then the inner ring. 6 suppressors, and the 2 power limiters. She set the parchment down. We should talk about the inner ring before we reach it. Talk, then. She sat across from him properly, the way she sat when she was about to say something that required the full weight of her attention. The inner ring suppressors are not like the outer ones. They're older and they're personal and they're specifically keyed to your dominant expression, not your general magical output. She paused. When we begin removing them, the bond activation will accelerate significantly. Harry held her gaze. Meaning the resonance between us will become more pronounced. More present. She said it clinically. He noticed the slight effort behind the clinical tone. It will be difficult to maintain professional distance during the later removals. I want you to know that in advance so it doesn't surprise you. Or you, he said. She held his gaze. Or me, she confirmed, after a moment. Apollon. He waited until she met his eyes properly, not the diagnostic look she used for the work. The other one. When the chains are off and the tribunal is done, I meant what I said. We find out what it actually is. But right now, you don't have to perform distance you don't feel. It's just us in this room. She was quiet. Outside, he could hear the embassy mourning, Vauquelin's voice, Hermione's, the ambient noise of people in motion. In here it was just the fire and the low frequency of his own magic and the warmth of hers that was always present when she was in the room, a warmth he was increasingly unable to pretend wasn't there. I haven't, she started. Stopped. I don't have a great deal of practice, she said carefully, at wanting things for myself. Outside of duty. Neither do I, Harry said. She looked at him. Something about the admission, the simple, undefended truth of it, seemed to reach her in a way that arguments wouldn't have. She nodded, once, and what she was nodding to was between them and didn't need to be said aloud. 3 more in this layer, she said. Then the inner ring. Let's start, Harry said. The owl arrived at 9:15. It was a Hogwarts owl, large, tawny, and carrying a sealed letter with Dumbledore's distinctive wax seal. It landed on the windowsill of the main sitting room and waited with the particular patience of a bird that had been instructed to accept no excuses for non-delivery. Harry took the letter. Broke the seal. Read it. It was, characteristically, 3 paragraphs long, and each paragraph did a great deal of work. The first paragraph expressed Dumbledore's desire for a conversation before the tribunal convened, private, without ambassadors or legal documentation, just the 2 of them, at a place of Harry's choosing. The second paragraph acknowledged, with the careful precision of a man who had been thinking about this for 2 days, that the suppressors had been wrong. Not misguided. Not an error of judgment. Wrong. The word sat alone in the sentence without qualification, which was, Harry recognized, the most uncomfortable thing Dumbledore had probably written in 30 years. The third paragraph said, there are things you need to know about why they were placed that I have not told you. Not justifications. Context. Things about your parentage, about your father's family line, about what you are and what you come from, that I kept from you for reasons that felt sound in 1985 and feel catastrophically arrogant in 2001. I would like to give you that context before strangers define it for you in a public tribunal. You deserve to hear it from the person who withheld it, not because it excuses anything, but because it is yours. Harry read it 3 times. He passed it to Apollon without comment. She read it. Passed it to Hermione. Hermione read it, and her expression ran through several things quickly. He's not wrong that there are gaps, Hermione said carefully, handing it back. In the tribunal documentation, I mean. Your father's lineage beyond the standard records is, I've been trying to trace it and the records become sparse past your grandfather Fleamont. There are things in the Potter family archive that were sealed. Sealed by whom? Ron said. The sealing charm is Dumbledore's. The room was quiet. Harry folded the letter. I'll meet him, he said. Harry, Fleur started. Not alone, Apollon said. Not asking. Stating. You, Harry said, to Apollon. Just you. Neutral ground, not Hogwarts, not the embassy. Somewhere else. He looked at Hermione. Is there a place in the Muggle city that has privacy wards strong enough that he couldn't use the location against us? Hermione thought for exactly 3 seconds. There's a property on the edge of Bloomsbury that the Ministry uses for classified creature meetings. It's on the International Registry, which means it's technically neutral territory under the Covenant. He can't initiate hostile magic there. That, Harry said. Can you arrange it? Give me 20 minutes, she said, already moving. He wrote the response himself. Bloomsbury Safe House. 2 o'clock. Come alone. I won't be alone. He didn't sign it with anything other than his name, which felt like the right amount of formality for the situation. The owl left. Harry looked at the ceiling for a moment, then went back to the sitting room with Apollon. 19 and 20, he said. She pulled up the diagram. Now. Now. The 19 came off in half an hour, the quiet kind, the integrated kind, the kind that left a particular hollow that his magic moved into with the careful curiosity of water finding a new level. The 20 was more complex. Apollon worked at it for 50 minutes and had to stop twice and let the surrounding structure settle before continuing, because this one was adjacent to the inner ring and pulling at it too hard risked disturbing the power limiters before they were ready to be touched. When it finally came free, Harry felt, language became inadequate around 60%. He felt himself and knew himself in a way that 17 years of being told who he was had not prepared him for, and it was like nothing he had a metaphor for except perhaps the moment in Prisoner of Azkaban when the Dementors had closed in and something had risen in him that he hadn't known was there, that had come out of nowhere fully formed, and this was that, except multiplied by everything, except settled and steady and entirely his own. 63, Apollon said quietly. You're operating at 63%. It feels like more, he said. It will feel like more with each one, she said. The inner ring is logarithmic. The difference between 63 and 70 is not 7 points. It is substantial. How long before the 2 o'clock meeting? 3 hours. She looked at him with the diagnostic precision. Are you ready to do this? Talk to him. Harry thought about the letter. About catastrophically arrogant. About Dumbledore writing the word wrong and letting it stand unqualified in a sentence. Yes, he said. I need to hear it. Even if it's painful. Especially if it's painful, Harry said. I'm done making decisions based on what I can handle. I can handle whatever it is. She looked at him. The open expression. Yes, she said quietly. You can. The Bloomsbury Safe House was a narrow Georgian townhouse that looked unremarkable from the street and was, behind its muggle-repelling wards, a space of considerable magical density, thick-walled, old-warded, with the particular heaviness of a building that had witnessed a great deal and absorbed all of it into its stones. Harry and Apollon arrived first. They took the 2 chairs on one side of the central table, which was the kind of table that had been in rooms where decisions got made, worn smooth by decades of elbows and forearms and the particular weight of important moments. Dumbledore arrived at 2 o'clock precisely. He came in without a dramatic entrance, which Harry had half expected and was almost grateful not to have. He was in his teaching robes, not the ceremonial ones, the plain grey ones he wore on ordinary school days, and he looked, in the grey afternoon light of the safe house, older than Harry had ever seen him look. Not diminished. Just, present in a way he usually wasn't, without the performance of wisdom providing him its usual architecture. He sat across from them and put his cane across the table and folded his hands and looked at Harry. Thank you for agreeing to this, he said. Don't thank me, Harry said. Tell me. Dumbledore looked at Apollon. She met his gaze with the flat equanimity of a woman who had heard many justifications in her life and assessed each one on its merits. He seemed to accept this arrangement. Your father, Dumbledore said, was, as far as the standard records show, a pure-blood wizard from an old British line. This is true as far as it goes. He paused. What the records do not show, what I sealed in 1985, 6 months after your parents died, is that the Potter line has a deeper ancestry that was deliberately obscured 4 generations back. Your great-great-grandfather on the Potter side was not entirely human. The room was very still. He was the child of a Veela dominant, Dumbledore said, and a human witch. A pairing that was, at the time, extraordinary enough that the family chose to conceal it. The dominant markers are recessive, they can skip generations. In most of the Potter descendants, they did. He looked at Harry. In you, they did not. Harry heard this. Held it. You knew, he said. You knew what I was before you ever placed the first suppressor. I suspected, before I knew, Dumbledore said. By the time you were 4 years old, the magical assessment that all children receive, which your aunt and uncle did not understand when the ministry conducted it remotely, flagged a creature-adjacent resonance that shouldn't have been there. I requested the full ancestral analysis. He folded his hands. I had it by Christmas of 1984. I had it for 6 months before your parents were killed. And you didn't tell them, Harry said. I told your father, Dumbledore said quietly. The silence stretched. James knew, Harry said. James knew he carried the dominant marker. He did not know it would fully manifest in you, the full expression was not guaranteed, and I hoped, genuinely, that it would not. His voice was even, the evenness of honesty rather than control. When you survived Voldemort and the resonance in you was unmistakable, when it was clear that whatever had happened in that house had not suppressed but amplified everything you carried, I made a decision. You were afraid of me, Harry said. Not accusingly. Just accurately. I was afraid, Dumbledore said, of what the world would do with you. A Veela dominant who was also the only known survivor of the killing curse, who was already the subject of a prophecy, who would grow up in the center of a war. He looked at his hands. I told myself the suppressors would come off when you were older. When the war was won. When the world was stable enough to what? Harry said. To survive me. To give you a fair chance, Dumbledore said. And I was wrong. I understand now that I was wrong. Not about the danger was real, Harry. The political and magical implications of a fully manifest dominant in the center of a wizarding war were genuinely, substantively dangerous. He looked up. But I had no right to make that calculation without you. And I had even less right to do it for 6 years without telling you, and telling myself it was protection. Harry looked at him across the table. He thought about being 4 years old and not knowing. He thought about being 11 and not knowing. He thought about every year in between. The ancestral records you sealed, Harry said. You'll unseal them. Yes, Dumbledore said. Immediately, no negotiation. You'll attend the tribunal. Yes. And you'll tell them everything, Harry said. Not the version that explains your reasoning. Everything, including which ministries you contacted and what you told them and what authorizations you secured and how you designed the binding architecture. A pause. The longest pause of the conversation. That will end my public life, Dumbledore said. I know, Harry said. He said it without cruelty and without satisfaction. He said it the way you say something that is simply true and must be said. Dumbledore held his gaze and Harry held his back, and it was, in its way, the most honest conversation they'd ever had. Not comfortable. Not warm. But real in a way their conversations had never managed to be before, because there was nothing between them anymore, no performance, no guided narrative, no careful positioning of Harry towards some necessary future that Dumbledore had already mapped. Just two people, one of whom had harmed the other, looking at each other honestly. I'll be there, Dumbledore said. And I will tell them everything. Apollon, who had been silent through all of this with the contained focus of someone witnessing something important, said, There is one more question. Dumbledore looked at her. The Potter family line, she said. The ancestral dominant marker. You understood what it meant when the bond eventually activated. Yes. You placed suppressors specifically designed to prevent bond activation, she said. You knew, therefore, that you were not simply suppressing a power. You were suppressing a relationship that had not yet happened. She paused. You were making a choice about another person's life, my life, without my knowledge or consent. Dumbledore was quiet. I was queen of the Veela nation before Harry was born, she said, and her voice was perfectly level in the way of something very deep and very old. I have been queen for 22 years. For 22 years I have governed, negotiated, and protected my people. For 22 years I have conducted myself according to the principle that no being has the right to determine another being's nature without their knowledge. She looked at Dumbledore. You suppressed my nation's sovereign interest in a bonded dominant for 17 years. Whatever your reasoning was for Harry, for my nation, there is no version of that reasoning that I can accept. Dumbledore met her gaze. And then he did something unexpected. He didn't argue, didn't qualify, didn't reach for the wisdom that had been the architecture of his defense for 60 years. He said, I know. I am sorry. 3 words. Unqualified. He said them to Apollon directly, looking at her, and Harry thought, that is probably the hardest thing he's ever done. And also, it is not enough, but it is real. Apollon received it with the grace of someone who had decided to be large in exactly this moment. She inclined her head, a fractional acknowledgement. Not forgiveness, not yet, possibly never entirely. But an acknowledgement. Harry stood. "We'll see you at the tribunal." Dumbledore picked up his cane. He stood, and at the door he stopped and looked at Harry one more time, and it was the look of someone trying to see a person they should have seen much earlier and reconciling themselves to the fact that they're seeing it now. Late. But now. "You're going to be remarkable," Dumbledore said. "Not as the boy who lived. Not as a symbol. Just, as yourself." "I know," Harry said. Dumbledore left. The room held its quiet. Harry stood for a moment in the particular aftermath of a conversation that had permanently rearranged several pieces of his understanding of his own life. Apollon stood beside him. She didn't offer comfort, because she'd understood from the beginning that comfort wasn't what he needed. She just stood there, present, solid, warm in the way she always was, and he felt through the remaining suppressors, 21 of them now, the inner ring and the 2 power limiters, the frequency of her closeness like the answer to a question he hadn't known how to finish asking. "My father knew what I was," Harry said. "Yes," she said. "He didn't tell anyone. He told Dumbledore. Perhaps he didn't know what else to do with it." Harry thought about James Potter, young, impulsive, deeply in love with a Muggle-born witch, navigating a war and a prophecy and the knowledge that his son was something the world had no map for. He thought about what that knowledge might have looked like, from the inside. Heavy, probably. Isolating. The way important things often are when you can't share them. "He died before he could tell my mother," Harry said. "We don't know that," Apollon said gently. "No," he said. "We don't." He breathed out. "I'm going to find out everything. After the tribunal. The sealed records, the ancestral line, all of it." He paused. "Will you help me with that?" She looked at him. "The Veela archives have records of every known dominant pairing going back 8 centuries, she said. "If your ancestor is there, I'll find them." "Thank you. Harry." She said his name the way she rarely did, just his name, no title, no honorific, no professional distance around it. "How are you?" He considered telling her fine. Considered performing equilibrium. Looked at her and found, as he often did now, that the performance had nowhere to land against her directness. "I'm glad I know," he said. "I'm sad it was him. He stopped. Searched. I've spent 6 years thinking the thing that made my life difficult was Voldemort. And he was a large part of it. But the other part was the people who were supposed to be on my side making decisions about who I got to be." He paused. "That's harder to be angry at. Because they weren't evil. They were just, afraid, and arrogant, and they didn't ask." "No," she said. "They didn't ask. They should have asked," he said. "From the beginning. They should have just asked." She held his gaze and said, very quietly, "Yes. They should have." They were back at the embassy by 4, and the remaining work had a different quality to it, not rushed, not forced, but certain. Like a river that knows the direction of the sea. Hermione had been busy in the interim. She'd received Amelia Bones's archive records at noon, and she and Vauquelin had spent 3 hours building them into the tribunal presentation with the thoroughness of 2 people who shared a deep commitment to documentation and had found, somewhat to their mutual surprise, that they worked well together. The presentation was now, Hermione informed them, watertight. She said it with the quiet satisfaction of someone who has built something they trust. Ron had managed the Greek situation, which had deteriorated as Apollon predicted. The shipping magnate had made his calls, and Greece's ambassador was wavering. Ron had handled this by finding the one thing he was always better at than everyone expected, the ability to sit with someone who was uncomfortable and talk to them like a person rather than a diplomatic situation, until the discomfort became manageable and the decision became clearer. He reported back that Greece was holding, and he delivered this information while eating his 3rd sandwich of the afternoon, which seemed about right. The afternoon session ran from 5 to 9. For suppressors. 21-17. Each one in the inner ring was, as Apollon had said, different. The 21st had been placed in Harry's third year, the year of the Dementors, the year of the Patronus, the year of the most powerful positive magic he'd ever managed. He felt it lift and understood immediately why someone had put it there. The Patronus charm, he now understood, wasn't just a happy memory. It was, for him, a dominant resonance. The stag wasn't his father. It was himself. He didn't say this aloud, but he could see from Apollon's expression that she'd felt it in the removal. Prongs, he said softly. She looked at him. He shook his head. Later, he said. I'll explain later. 22, 23, 24, each one less like pulling a splinter and more like removing scaffolding from a building that no longer needed it, the structure within already strong enough to hold itself. And with each one, the bond frequency sharpened. He felt it the way you feel the specific warmth of one heat source in a room with others, not diffuse, not general. Directional. He could feel exactly where she was without looking. At 3 feet, at 10, if she moved out of the room he felt it as a subtraction. He suspected she felt the same, based on the way she didn't move out of the room. The 24th came off at 9, and by that point the room was different around him. Subtly, not glowing, not charged with anything theatrical. Just different the way a room is different when something true is in it. The others felt it. He could see them feel it, Ron looking at him with that look he'd had at the safe house, steady and quiet. Hermione with her quill set down, just watching. Fleur with her hand on the doorframe and something in her expression that was so nakedly glad it was almost difficult to look at. 24 down. 29 to go. He was operating, Apollon told him, at 71%. 7 more tomorrow, he said. Then the power limiters. The power limiters cannot be removed here, she said. I told you, population centers. The Hogwarts grounds, he said. There's a place by the lake. Far enough from the castle, warded by the wards themselves, and old enough that it can, absorb it. If anything needs absorbing. She thought about this. The Hogwarts wards are sufficiently strong, she said. But we'll need permission. McGonagall will give it, Harry said. She gave us a look when we left Dumbledore's office that told me exactly which side of this she was on. She'll need to be asked formally, Apollon said. I'll owl her tonight, Hermione said, already reaching. One more thing, Harry said. He looked around the room, his people, his improbable small team that had held together through 3 days of this without fracturing or flagging. Ron with his steady presence. Hermione with her extraordinary mind. Fleur with her ferocious loyalty. Baucelin with his meticulous professionalism. Apollon, who was all of those things and also something else, something he didn't have a word for yet, except that the word was close. Tomorrow night, Harry said, at the lake. All of us. All of us, Ron confirmed, with the tone of someone to whom this has never been a question. Except that the night didn't end there. At 11 o'clock, the embassy's outer ward alarm triggered. Not the gradual alert of a warding system registering approach, the sharp, immediate trigger that meant someone had attempted a penetration spell against the boundary. Baucelin was on his feet in seconds, wand in hand, and Harry was already at the main window when the second alarm sounded, a different frequency, the interior courtyard. 3 figures. Black robes, faces obscured. The particular posture of people who had come to do something rather than say something. Ministry? Ron said, appearing at Harry's shoulder. No, Harry said. He was looking at the way they moved. These aren't Aurors. Aurors identify themselves. These came in at 11 at night through the back ward. He watched them. One of them was casting a suppression dome. He could see the edges of it beginning to form, a wide radius spell designed to prevent magical signal from leaving the area. They're trying to cut off the embassy's communication. Which means they don't want anyone to know what they're doing here, Fleur said, from the doorway. Her wand was in her hand. Her expression had gone from worried to something considerably more focused. "Who sent them?" Apollon said. She was behind Harry, looking over his shoulder. Her voice was quiet and utterly cold. "Someone who needs the embassy communications down before morning," Harry said. "Before the tribunal. Someone who decided they had 12 hours to stop whatever they couldn't stop through official channels." "Dumbledore?" Ron said. "Not his style," Harry said. "He makes decisions. He doesn't send people in the dark." He thought about who in this situation needed the tribunal stopped badly enough to be reckless. Who hadn't yet been cornered into compliance. "The 3 European ministries," he said. "The ones who co-signed the original suppressor authorizations. They're in the tribunal documentation. Full exposure. They'd rather the documentation not reach the tribunal," Apollon said. "Yeah." He turned from the window. "They shouldn't have done this." There was a quality to his voice that made everyone in the room pay attention in a different way. Not louder. Not harder. Just, a certainty, a weight of intention that was new. That was, Harry realized, 63% of himself deciding something and the 37% he didn't have yet simply following the lead. He went to the front door. "Harry," Apollon said. "Stay inside," he said. "All of you." He paused at the door. "This will take about 2 minutes." He walked out. The night was cold and clear, and the courtyard was lit by a security lamp that cast everything in amber. The 3 figures became aware of him immediately. He was not subtle about it, not approaching quietly. He walked into the courtyard the way you walk into a room that belongs to you. The one casting the suppression dome stopped. The dome half-formed, ragged at the edges. "I'm going to give you one opportunity," Harry said, to the 3 of them. "Leave the ward, leave the area, and tell whoever sent you that their names are going into the tribunal documentation whether they're in here or not." He stopped in the center of the courtyard. "That's the opportunity." For a moment nothing happened. The 3 of them looked at each other with the particular communication of people who had a plan and were now reconsidering whether the plan accounted for this. One of them made the wrong choice. The curse that came at Harry was dark and fast, the green-tinged edge of something malicious, and it covered the 15 feet between them in under a second. Harry sidestepped it. Not dramatically. Not with any flourish. He stepped to the left and the curse went through the space where he'd been and hit the courtyard wall and left a scorch mark, and in the same motion, without drawing his wand, without doing anything theatrical, he simply extended his hand, palm out. What came from him wasn't a specific spell. He didn't have the words for it. At 63%, with 24 suppressors gone and 29 left, what came from Harry Potter when he didn't bother with incantations was a wave of compressed magical force that hit all 3 of them simultaneously with the impact of a concussive wall and laid them flat on the courtyard ground, where they stayed because the force of it had also planted a temporary binding into the stone beneath them, holding them there with an efficiency that suggested he'd done it without thinking about the mechanics. He had, in fact, done it without thinking about the mechanics. He looked at the 3 people on the ground. Looked at his hand. Thought, 63%. Then thought, 29 more. "Right," he said, quietly, to no one in particular. He went back inside and found 4 people in the entrance hall pretending they hadn't all been watching through the door. 2 minutes, Ron said. "Spot on." "I said I'd take the opportunity," Harry said. They declined. He looked at Apollon. "We need to flood the Auror office. 3 intruders, incapacitated, courtyard. Tell them who they are." "Their identities," she said. "I caught their wand signatures when they cast," Harry said. "Send the signatures to Auror HQ with a request for identification. Whoever they come back as, those names go into the tribunal file tonight." Apollon looked at him with the open expression, the one she wasn't managing. Something moved in it that was complicated and certain and arrived in his chest like warm pressure. "Tonight," she confirmed. The orders came. The identities were confirmed by midnight, 2 operatives from a private security firm contracted by the Belgian and Swiss magical ministries, neither of which had been among the 14 coalition nations, both of which had co-signed the original suppressor authorization 4 years ago. Vauquelin had them added to the tribunal file by 1 in the morning. Harry sat on the embassy terrace in the cold, looking at the London sky, and thought about 29 suppressors and tomorrow's lake and the end of this particular sequence. He thought about his father knowing and not knowing and the stag in the mist at the edge of a frozen lake in 3rd year. He thought about Apollon, inside, warm, doing the work. He thought about after. He went back inside and slept. McGonagall's response owl arrived at dawn, the grounds and the lake are yours. I will ensure the students are kept to the castle. The wards will cooperate. M. McGonagall. And beneath that, in a second hand, smaller, I knew something was wrong. I'm sorry I didn't know sooner. Harry read it and folded it carefully and put it in his inside pocket, where it stayed against his chest through the morning. Chapter 6, Sovereignty. The morning of the tribunal, Harry woke before the alarm. He lay still for a moment in the embassy room and took inventory, not of his emotions, not yet, but of himself. The magic. 29 suppressors through the night, and then however many they could manage this morning before the lake, before the final 2, before the tribunal at 3. He counted what was free. 24 spaces, 24 opened windows. He could feel all of them, not as individual things anymore but as a composite, a sense of himself that was larger and more complete than anything he'd operated from before. And beneath it, through the inner ring's remaining bonds, the power limiters sitting like load-bearing stone at the center of everything, patient, heavy, enormous in their implications. He got up. Put on his robes. Went to find Apollon. She was at the kitchen table with tea and the diagram, which by now was covered in crossings out and annotations and looked like a document that had survived a war, which in some sense it had. She looked up when he came in and did the thing she did in the mornings. A quick assessment, the diagnostic habit, checking his state the way a doctor checks a patient before a procedure. How do you feel? She said. Ready, he said. She looked at him for another moment. Yes, she said. You are. He sat across from her. She poured him tea without being asked, the automatic hospitality of someone who had gotten used to him, and he took it and wrapped both hands around the mug and looked at the diagram between them. Walk me through today, he said. She pulled the diagram toward her. This morning, before we leave for Hogwarts, these 4. She pointed to 4 suppressors in the outer edge of the inner ring. They're linked in a pair of pairs. Remove them in sequence and the structure stabilizes for the final removal. She moved her finger to the 6 remaining inner ring suppressors. At the lake, these 6. Then, she stopped. Moved her finger to the 2 red marks at the center. The power limiters, Harry said. The power limiters, she confirmed. When those come off, she looked up from the diagram to him, I want to be honest with you about what I don't know. I've removed mate suppressors before. Power limiters at this level, limiters that have been in place since early childhood, that have shaped your entire magical development, I've never done this. No one has. Because no one has had 53 suppressors, Harry said. Because no one has had 53 suppressors, she agreed. The theory is sound. The sequencing is correct. But the practical reality of a dominant releasing this much compressed development at once, she paused. You may need time afterward. Before the tribunal. How much time? I don't know. Harry nodded. We start early then. She rolled the diagram. We start now. The 4 morning suppressors came off between 7 and 9, in the sitting room, with everyone present because no one had suggested they shouldn't be and no one had left. The first 2 were easier than expected, Apollon sequencing had been correct, removing the outer pair first relaxed something in the inner structure, and the second pair followed almost willingly. The 3rd suppressor, when it lifted, made the windows shake. Nothing broke. But the glass hummed for 30 seconds like a struck bell. The fourth one, the last of the morning set, sitting directly adjacent to the inner ring's 6, took Apollon 40 minutes and every scrap of her concentration, and when it finally released, Harry felt the inner ring for the first time without anything between himself and it. Felt the 6 remaining suppressors and the 2 power limiters with a clarity that was almost painful. Like looking directly at something very bright after years of looking through glass. He felt the bond, too. Clearly now. Not the abstract warmth of proximity. The actual thing, specific, directional, enormous, and entirely unmistakable. He looked at Apollon, who was 3 feet away and looking back at him, and they both felt it and neither of them pretended otherwise. 6 more, he said. Then the lake. 6 more, she confirmed. He watched her push her hair back from her face, a rare, unguarded gesture, and thought about what she told him about 20 years of duty and 10 years of not believing this story was hers. He thought about after. He thought about the fact that after was now close enough to be a real thing rather than a theoretical comfort. Apollon, he said. She looked at him. Thank you, he said. Not for the tribunal or the coalition. For this. For, he gestured, and the gesture encompassed the sitting room and the past 4 days and the diagram and the careful, steady work of someone who had found him in a corridor and decided he deserved to be free. For all of this. She held his gaze. Something moved in her expression, not the open look, not the managed one. Something new, a third thing that was quieter than either. You don't need to thank me, she said. I know, he said. I wanted to. She looked at him for a long moment in which several things that didn't need saying were communicated without being said, and then she said, 6 more. Then we go to the lake. 6 more, Harry said. They arrived at Hogwarts at noon. McGonagall met them at the gate, just her, no one else, which was the right call and told Harry she'd understood what this moment needed. She was in her everyday teaching robes, her hair pinned back, and she looked at Harry with the expression of someone who had spent several days in an acute state of retrospective guilt and had come out the other side into something more useful. The students are in class, she said. The ground staff have been given the afternoon off. The wards have been, I've spoken to them. She said this without embarrassment, though it was the kind of thing wizards rarely admitted to doing. They know what's happening. Thank you, Professor, Harry said. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him after the Triwizard Tournament, assessing, precise, not willing to let emotion make her dishonest. You look different, she said. 28 suppressors removed, he said. She closed her eyes briefly. Opened them. Albus will be at the tribunal. I know. He told me everything, she said. Last night. He sat in my office and told me everything. She paused. I have been his colleague for 40 years. I want you to know that I had no knowledge of the suppressors. That I would not have, she stopped. Collected herself. I would not have permitted it. I know, Harry said. I know you wouldn't have. She looked at him for another moment with that expression, the retrospective guilt and the more useful thing, and then she stepped aside and let them through. The grounds were extraordinary in the midday light, Hogwarts casting its particular spell on the world around it, the castle stone warm gold, the lake flat and dark and deep. The 6 of them walked through the grounds, Harry, Apollon, Fleur, Ron, Hermione, and Vauquelin, who had come because Apollon had asked him to and because he'd spent 4 days watching this and had earned the right to see the end of it. The lake's far edge was quiet in the way of very old places when they're paying attention. The beech tree stood in its enormous patience at the water's edge, and the water itself was still, and the Hogwarts wards hummed around them like a held note, like the castle leaning in. Harry stopped at the water's edge. Turned to face Apollon. 6, he said. 6, she confirmed. Do them all, he said. In sequence. Don't stop between them. She looked at him carefully. That's going to be, I know what it's going to be, he said. Do them in sequence. I don't want to stop and start. I want them all off. She looked at him for a long moment, and he looked back, and whatever she was checking for she found. The others should step back, she said. 30 feet, at minimum. Ron took Hermione's arm and they moved back. Fleur went without being told. Bachlan retreated to the edge of the beech tree's shadow and stood there with the stillness of someone bearing witness. Apollon stepped close to Harry. Closer than she usually did for the work, close enough that the bond between them was not an undercurrent but a presence, and Harry felt it the way you feel the sun on your face, direct and warm and entirely unambiguous. Are you ready? She said. Yes, he said. She put both hands against his chest this time, and her magic threaded through the space around him with a precision that was beyond clinical. It was intimate, the intimacy of someone who had spent 4 days learning the exact shape of his magical architecture and now moved through it with the certainty of familiarity. He felt her find the first of the 6. She pulled. The 29th suppressor came off and the world expanded. Not the courtyard, not the room, not any enclosed space, the open sky over the lake and the grounds and the castle, and still the world expanded, because what had been held back and was now released was not something contained by geography. She didn't stop. The 30th, before the resonance of the 29th had finished moving through him. He breathed. Found the ground. Stayed. The 31st made the lake surface move, a ripple, outward from nothing, expanding in a perfect ring to the far shore. He heard Hermione make a sound from 30 feet behind him. Stayed. The 32nd. He felt this one lift and recognized it the way you recognize a voice. It had been placed the summer after 4th year, with the others in that cluster, and it had muted specifically the dominant resonance that the graveyard ritual had, paradoxically, amplified. Voldemort's blood magic had touched something in him that night and activated a frequency the suppressors couldn't fully hold, and so someone had added a new one to hold the gap, and now it was gone, and what came back was the memory of the graveyard and the magic that had met Voldemort's that night and matched it, and he understood now what that matching had been. Not just love. Not just his mother's protection. Himself. The 33rd. The wind came up over the lake, which had been entirely still, and moved through the grounds in every direction from where they stood, warm despite the time of year, and the beech trees' leaves moved all at once, and somewhere in the castle above them, windows opened on their own. Apollon pulled the 34th and last of the inner ring, and Harry made a sound that was not voluntary and not dignified, and he did not care about either of those things, because what rushed into the space was 6 years and 4 days and 28 suppressors worth of himself finally arriving. She stepped back. He stood at the edge of the lake and breathed. The grounds were absolutely still. Then a sound, from the castle, through the wards, something that the castle itself made that was not an alarm and not a bell and not any constructed sound but the resonance of 400 years of stone and magic registering that something had arrived that it recognized. Harry, Apollon said quietly. Are you with me? Yes, he said. He turned to look at her. He felt 63 and change no longer. He had no number for it. He felt the edges of himself and found they were large and entirely his own, and the bond between them at this distance was so clear it was like a visible thread. The limiters, he said. The limiters, she confirmed. She was watching him with an expression that was not the open one and not the managed one and not the third quiet thing from this morning. It was something new, something he didn't have a word for, something that looked like the expression of a person standing close to something extraordinary and feeling two things simultaneously, awe, and recognition. These will be, Harry, these will be substantial. I know. The castle might, I know, he said. Do it. She stepped close again. Both hands. He felt her magic find the first power limiter, deep in the center of him, the keystone of the whole architecture, and she didn't pull gently this time. She couldn't, gently wouldn't reach it. She reached in with everything she had and she pulled with the full force of the Veela Queen's magic, and the first power limiter broke. The sound was not a sound. It was the world-changing register. The lake erupted, not water, not spray, but a wave of concussive magical force that moved outward from where Harry stood and hit the far shore and the castle and the tree line and the sky simultaneously. The beech tree bent, not broken, bowing. Behind them, from 30 feet away, he heard 3 people brace against it and hold. The Hogwarts wards rang like a bell struck at its resonant frequency, a single clear enormous note that moved through the stones of the castle and outward, and in the castle, every student felt it and none of them could explain it, and later they would describe it as the moment the castle sang. Harry stood in the middle of it and stood and breathed and was 70% and more and growing, and the bond was a roar now, a frequency so clear it was almost visible, connecting him to the woman 3 feet away with the directness of 2 things that have always belonged together arriving finally in the same place. She found the second power limiter. She pulled. What happened next was not describable in sequence. It was simultaneous. It was everything at once, the limiter lifting, the 37% of himself that he'd never had access to flooding back all at once, the full resonance of the dominant marker activating completely for the first time in 17 years, the bond slamming into full clarity like a lamp being lit in a dark room, illuminating every corner. He felt himself. Not part of himself. Not a compressed version, not a managed version, not the 30 or 63% of himself that various institutional fears had decided was the safe amount. All of it. Every bit. The lake was a chaos of moving water. The sky had done something extraordinary, clouds moving away in a ring from above them, clearing to a wide circle of autumn blue. The wards of Hogwarts were humming at a frequency that Hermione would later describe as almost musical. The grounds themselves were still, not the stillness of emptiness but the stillness of attention, the way a room goes still when something historic happens in it. Harry breathed in. Breathed out. Turned to Apollon. She was 3 feet away and looking at him, and the expression on her face was the new one, the extraordinary one, the ion recognition one, and the bond between them was not pulling or demanding or anything other than simply, obviously, completely itself. "Hi," Harry said. She laughed. The Real laugh, the one from the summit corridor, the warm one that landed in his chest. "Hello," she said. "All of them," he said. She looked at him with the diagnostic habit. Then her eyes widened, just slightly. "All of them," she said. 53 suppressors. Gone. Ron said, from 30 feet away, "Is it done?" "It's done," Harry said, without turning around. A pause. Then Ron said, "Brilliant," with the feeling of someone who has been holding their breath for 4 days. Hermione made a sound that was attempting to be academic and not quite managing it. Fleur said something in French that Harry didn't catch, but Apollon's expression suggested it was the emotional and somewhat excessive response Apollon had predicted. Harry looked at Apollon. She looked back at him. The bond was not pressure, not compulsion, not the mate magic that romance novels made it sound like. It was clarity. The particular clarity of knowing, simply and completely, something true. "After," he said. She held his gaze. "After," she agreed, and this time after was 3 hours away and felt, for the first time, entirely real. The International Magical Tribunal convened at 3 o'clock in the Ministry of Magic's largest chamber, which had been expanded by a factor of 4 to accommodate the delegations from 14 nations plus the British Wisengamot, the international legal observers, the press, and a considerable number of people who had found reasons to be in the building and had absolutely no intention of leaving. Harry walked in at 2:50 in his own robes, with Apollon on his left and Hermione on his right, and the room stopped. Not metaphorically. The actual movement of people, the ambient sound, the 1,000 small motions of a busy chamber, all of it stopped for the 3 seconds it took for every person in the room to register what had walked through the door. Not the boy who lived. Not the chosen one. Not the symbol. Harry Potter, 100% himself, walking into a room he'd already decided the outcome of. He did not look around. He did not acknowledge the silence. He walked to the designated seat of the affected party, which was at the front of the chamber in a chair that was, He noticed with some amusement, slightly too ornate, the ministry's idea of dignified, all carved mahogany and green velvet. He sat in it like it was the kitchen chair at the Desleys, the same ease, the same complete lack of performance. Apollon took the Veela nation seat to his left. Vauquelin arrayed the documentation with the efficiency of a man born to the work. The Wisengamot entered. Fudge, pale and holding his lime-green bowler hat with both hands like a life-preserver. Amelia Bones, beside him, with the expression of someone who had made her decision and was standing in it. The 47 seated Wisengamot members filing into their seats with the mixture of expressions that ranged from grim resolution to barely contained panic. Then Dumbledore. He entered from the side door, with no fanfare, in his grey teaching robes, alone. He walked to the seat designated for primary respondents and sat, and he didn't look around the room except once. Once, briefly, at Harry. Harry met his gaze. Held it. Then looked forward. The tribunal's 3 presiding judges entered, representatives from the International Confederation of Wizards, 2 of whom Harry didn't recognize and one of whom was a French witch named Magistrate Celeste Moreau, who had the bearing of someone who has run these proceedings before and found the preparation of lesser institutions perpetually inadequate. Moreau opened proceedings. The International Magical Tribunal convenes in the matter of documented violations of the 1847 Covenant, Article 17, Sections B through D, and the Supplementary Creature Rights Protocols of 1923 and 1971. The affected party is Harry James Potter. The primary respondent is Albus Percival Wulfric Brian Dumbledore. Secondary respondents include the British Ministry of Magic, the British Wisengamot, and 3 European magical ministries. She looked at the room without blinking. The tribunal has reviewed preliminary documentation from all parties. We will hear testimony in the following order: the affected party, the Veela Queen as bonded sovereign, the primary respondent, and the secondary respondents. Documentary evidence will be entered as presented. She paused. We will begin. She looked at Harry. Mr. Potter. Harry stood. The room settled into an absolute silence that had weight. He didn't have notes. He'd thought about notes and decided against them, because this was not the kind of thing that needed notes. 6 years ago, he said, the first mate suppressor was placed on me without my knowledge or consent. I was 11 years old. He let this land. I was 11 years old and someone decided that what I was made me too dangerous to be permitted to be it. Not because I had done anything. Not because the power had harmed anyone. Because it existed. He looked at the tribunal judges, not at the room. Over the next 6 years, 52 more suppressors were added. Some by the Wisengamot, some by international ministries, some by individuals acting on their own authority, and some by the person sitting in the respondent's chair, who designed the binding architecture, who coordinated the institutional effort, and who did so, I believe, with genuine conviction that he was protecting me. He paused. That conviction does not create consent. That conviction does not create legality. And that conviction, most importantly, does not mean it was right. He let this settle. I am not here to ask for sympathy, he said. I'm here because what was done to me was done under the protection of institutions. Under treaty. Under the authority of people who had been granted power precisely to prevent this kind of harm. He looked now at the Wisengamot section. Those institutions failed. And this tribunal exists so that when institutions fail, the failure is named and the remedy is real. He sat down. The silence held for 3 full seconds. Then Magistrate Moreau said, "Thank you, Mr. Potter," with the gravity of someone who has heard many testimonies and knew when one was exceptional. Apollon stood next. She spoke for 8 minutes in the particular cadence of someone who has thought about exactly this moment for 4 days and possibly 20 years, precise, measured, devastating in the way that precise and measured things are when what they're measuring is 22 years of sovereign interest suppressed by a coordinated institutional action. She entered the Veela nation's formal documentation, the ancestral records of every known dominant pairing, the historical record of the 10th century precedent that Dumbledore had cited, and she corrected with the specificity of someone who had the actual records and was not interested in mythology. She sat. Dumbledore stood. The room shifted. 40 years of authority in a room changes its texture, and Dumbledore's standing was 40 years of authority, and the room felt it even now. "I placed the first suppressor," he said, in October of 1991. Harry was 11 years old and had just arrived at Hogwarts, and the Veela resonance in him was already strong enough that I was measuring it in the wards. He paused. "I was afraid. I want to be very clear about that. The decision was made from fear, and I used every argument available to me, historical precedent, the ongoing war with Voldemort, the safety of those around him, to dress that fear in the language of necessity." He looked at his hands, briefly. Fear dressed as necessity is still fear. And fear, no matter how well dressed, does not justify what I did. He went through it. All of it, the ancestral record, the James Potter conversation, the institutional coordination, the design of the binding architecture, the annual editions, the power limiters. He went through it with the thorough, unflinching completeness of a man who has decided that the only thing he has left to offer is the truth delivered without evasion. It took 40 minutes. The room was so silent that Harry could hear the scratch of the tribunal stenographer and the occasional sound of someone in the gallery making a small involuntary noise at a revelation. When Dumbledore sat, his face had the quality of something that has been put down. Not defeat. Something closer to relief, the particular relief of a very heavy thing, carried for a very long time, finally set on the ground. Amelia Bones testified for 30 minutes and entered 23 pages of archive records that she had retrieved with her Level 7 clearance and which she presented without commentary beyond what was factually necessary, which was exactly right. The secondary respondents' representatives, mostly legal counsel, carefully worded institutional statements, were heard in order. They were not, Harry thought, particularly interesting compared to what had come before. Magistrate Moreau called a recess at 5:15. She returned at 5:45. "The tribunal has reviewed the documentation in full," she said, to the chamber. "The findings are as follows." She read them. The suppressors constituted violations of Article 17, Sections B, C, and D, full violations, not partial. The coordination across multiple institutions qualified as a conspiracy under the supplementary creature rights protocols. The application to a minor without consent or guardian notification elevated the severity. The international coordination, the involvement of 3 European ministries, made it explicitly a matter of international treaty law. The remedies were significant. Britain was required to submit to a full international audit of its creature regulation practices, to be conducted over the following 18 months. The implicated European ministries received formal censure and would face their own national tribunal processes. The Wisengamot members who had knowingly authorized the suppressor program were individually named in the ruling, 14 of them, and referred to the British Magical Legal Authority for prosecution. And Albus Dumbledore was stripped of his positions, headmaster of Hogwarts, chief warlock of the Wisengamot, supreme mugwump of the International Confederation of Wizards, pending the outcome of a separate criminal hearing before the British Magical Legal Authority. The room erupted. Harry sat in the noise of it and felt, not triumph. Something steadier than triumph. The particular satisfaction of a thing being correct. Of a scale that has been weighted unfairly for years finally being balanced, not because the world is just but because people had stood in specific places and refused to move. He looked at Dumbledore. The old man was sitting very still in his chair, and he was not looking at the room. He was looking at his hands. And then, as though he felt the look, he raised his eyes and met Harry's. Harry nodded. Once. Not forgiveness, not yet, not entirely. But something. An acknowledgement that the man across the room was not simply his jailer. That he was a person who had done a terrible wrong and come, at the end of it, to name it. That this was insufficient and also real, and both of those things could be true simultaneously. Dumbledore inclined his head. Then he looked away. Outside the chamber, in the corridor, the world had reorganized itself. Reporters, officials, delegations. The French contingent in animated conversation with the Spanish. Amelia Bones standing with 3 Wisengamot members who had been named in the ruling, looking like a person who had expected this and finds it no less unpleasant for having expected it. Fudge somewhere in the back of the crowd, his lime green bowler hat back on his head, speaking to a journalist with the expression of a man managing a disaster in real time. Harry stood in the corridor and people moved around him and he let them, watching the currents of consequence move through the building. Ron appeared at his shoulder. "How are you?" "Good," Harry said. Actually meant it. "Brilliant, isn't it?" Ron said, with a simplicity that was entirely genuine. "When things go right." "It is," Harry said. Hermione appeared from the other side, slightly flushed, already in what Harry recognized as her post-victory processing mode. "The 18-month audit scope is broader than I expected," she said. "The language in the second remedy clause could be extended to cover, Harry, I think this could substantively affect creature rights legislation across." "Write it up," Harry said. "All of it. Everything you think it could affect. I'll read it tonight." She blinked. "You will?" "Yes," he said. "Because you're right about it and it matters and someone's going to have to push the follow-through." He looked at her. "Let's do that together." Hermione's expression did something complicated and fond. "Together," she agreed. Fleur materialized from the direction of the French delegation, grabbed Harry by the arm, and said, "Come," in the tone that didn't discuss. She pulled him away from the crowd into a side corridor that was temporarily empty, and turned to face him with the expression of someone who has been waiting to say something for 4 days. "Well," she said. "Well what?" Harry said. "Don't be obtuse." "You're not obtuse, it doesn't suit you." She looked at him with the directness that was entirely her mother's but deployed with a warmth that was entirely her own. "The tribunal is done. The suppressors are off. The declaration is on record." She paused. "So. Well." Harry looked at her. "I told you I'd wait until after," he said. "After was 45 minutes ago," she said. "Fleur." "Harry." He laughed, which was probably what she'd been aiming for. "Where is she?" "In the antechamber," Fleur said. "With Vauquelin, wrapping up the formal documentation. 5 minutes, maybe 10. She looked at him. "Go be somewhere, she'll find you. And if she needs more time." Harry said. "She's had 22 years, Fleur said. Go." He found a window at the end of the corridor, one of the Ministry's enchanted windows, permanent artificial sky, today's programming being a convincing early evening, the light going amber and low. He stood in front of it with his hands in his pockets and felt, himself. Completely himself. 100%. No compression, no redirection, no careful institutional management of what he was permitted to be. It was, he thought, a very good feeling. He heard her footsteps. Her walk was distinct, not loud, never loud, but unhurried in a way that most people weren't unhurried, the stride of someone to whom the concept of rushing had been thoroughly considered and rejected. Apollon stopped beside him at the window. For a moment they both looked at the artificial evening. "Vauquelin is handling the remaining documentation," she said. "Good," Harry said. "The Greek ambassador wants a follow-up meeting." "Also good," Harry said. "The tribunal ruling will be published in the International Record by midnight." "Apollon," Harry said. "Yes. Are you listing administrative tasks because you're nervous?" A pause. "Possibly," she said. He turned to look at her. She turned to look at him, and they were close enough that the bond, clear and enormous and entirely itself now, was like a warm hand between them, not pulling, just present, the way the truth is present when you've stopped avoiding it. "The suppressors are off," he said. "The tribunal is done. It's just us." She held his gaze. In the amber light of the artificial window she looked, remarkable was still the word his vocabulary produced, and it was still both too much and not enough. "I know," she said. "What do you feel?" he said. "Not what the bond feels." "What do you feel?" She was quiet for a moment. The real quiet, the decision quiet. "Terrified," she said. "And entirely certain." She looked at him. "Those two things seem contradictory." "They're not," Harry said. "Certain is when you're not afraid of the answer even though you're afraid of the question." She looked at him for a long moment. "How are you 17, she said, and it wasn't rhetorical, it was the slightly dazed observation of someone recalibrating. "I've had an unusual several years," he said. She laughed, the real one, the warm one, the one that landed where it always landed. And then she reached up and put her hand against his face, the same careful precision she used for everything, and looked at him at close range with the expression that was neither the open one nor the managed one nor the third quiet thing but something beyond all of those, something new, something that hadn't existed before this week because it hadn't had the conditions to exist. "After," she said softly. "We're here," he said. She kissed him. Or he kissed her. It was, like most true things, impossible to say who moved first and irrelevant. It was brief and warm and entirely real, and when they separated the artificial evening through the window had gone several shades deeper and from down the corridor they could hear the distant ambient sound of the ministry reorganizing itself around the new world it had just been handed. "What happens now?" Apollon said. Not anxiously. Just curious. Harry thought about it. 18 months of international audit. Hermione's follow-on legislation notes. The Potter ancestral records to unseal. The Veela archives to search. Dumbledore's hearing. The Wizengamot reconstruction. The ripple effects of 14 nations standing in a specific place and refusing to move. He thought about all of it and found that instead of the weight he'd expected, it sat lightly. Not because it was small. Because he was finally, for the first time, the actual size of it. "A lot," he said. "A lot happens now." "Good," she said. "I've been bored." He looked at her. "You have not been bored." "No," she agreed. "But this is more interesting than not bored." She straightened, took his arm with the decision of someone who has decided. "Come. Vauquelin will need signatures. Your friends will want dinner. And Fleur is going to be insufferable when she sees us together, so we should find her quickly and get it over with." "She's going to be extremely pleased with herself," Harry agreed. "She already is," Apollon said, with the resigned affection of a mother who knows her daughter extremely well. "She told me 40 minutes ago, before the tribunal ended, that this was going to work out." She said it with complete confidence. It was infuriating. "She knew," Harry said. "She knew before either of us did." "She always does," Apollon said. "It's her worst quality." They walked back down the corridor together, toward the light and the noise and the considerable, complicated, interesting work of the world that had just become new. 3 weeks later, the Potter ancestral records were unsealed in a ceremony that was technically administrative and practically historic. The moment the sealed archive opened and Apollon's hand found the entry she'd been looking for, 840 years old, written in Old French in the Veela High Council's formal record, describing a pairing between a Veela dominant and a human which that had been the foundation of a lineage, a bloodline, a long quiet inheritance that had traveled through generations of ordinary-seeming people until it arrived here, in a boy who had grown up in a cupboard and survived everything, and had turned out to be something the world had been waiting for 1,000 years without knowing it was waiting. Harry read the entry and looked at Apollon and said, 840 years. "Give or take," she said. "A long time to find someone," he said. She looked at him with the expression, the new one, the extraordinary one. "Worth it," she said. He thought about 53 suppressors and 14 nations and a corridor in the ministry and a woman who had stopped mid-step and looked across a room at the specific shape of something she'd stopped believing in. "Yeah," he said. "Worth it." Dumbledore's hearing was 6 months later. He pled fully, no defense of necessity, no argument of outcome. The British Magical Legal Authority sentenced him to 5 years of supervised restriction of his magical practice, the loss of all public office in perpetuity, and a mandatory restorative process with the 14 individuals identified as directly affected by the suppressor program. The sentence was, in the opinion of the international legal observers, appropriate. It was, in Dumbledore's own opinion, lenient. He accepted it without appeal and began the restorative process the following week. He and Harry met twice during that process. The meetings were not warm, exactly. But they were honest, which was something they had never managed to be before, and honesty, Harry had learned, was a better foundation than warmth for the kind of complicated relationship that required years to work through. Hermione's follow-on legislation paper ran to 86 pages and was submitted to the International Confederation of Wizards within 4 months. It proposed 8 specific amendments to creature rights treaty law, drawing on the tribunal ruling as its primary precedent. 5 of the 8 passed within 2 years. Ron, asked later what he remembered most about the 4 days at the embassy, said, the moment Harry walked out into the courtyard at night and just sorted it. 3 people. No wand. 2 minutes. I think that was when I understood that it had actually worked. That he was actually free. Fleur said nothing when asked what she remembered. She just smiled with the expression of a person who had known the answer before the question. McGonagall wrote to Harry the week after the tribunal. The letter was 2 paragraphs, which for McGonagall was long. The first paragraph addressed the Hogwarts ward still humming at a different frequency since the day at the lake, and whether this was cause for concern, and her tentative conclusion that it was not cause for concern but was perhaps cause for interest. The second paragraph said, "You were always more than any of us allowed you to be. I am sorry for every part one played in the allowing. I am glad you became it anyway." Harry wrote back and told her the ward's humming was fine. He wrote 3 lines to her 2 paragraphs, which was, for Harry, long. And on a Tuesday evening in November, in Apollin's quarters in the French Magical Embassy, with the London sky doing something complicated and dark beyond the windows, Harry Potter sat at a table with Apollin Delacour and a cup of tea and a stack of Veela historical records they were working through together, and the bond between them was not extraordinary anymore, not in the sense of remarkable, not in the sense of requiring explanation. It was just true. The way things are when they've arrived where they belong. He looked across the table at her. She was reading, one hand tracing a line of text, her hair loose, the lamp making gold of everything. She looked up, felt the look, met his eyes. "What?" she said. "Nothing," he said. She looked at him for a moment longer with the expression that was now familiar enough to be itself rather than remarkable, the expression that was Apollin, specifically, looking at Harry, specifically, without managing anything. "Nothing," she agreed, and went back to reading. Outside, London moved through its ordinary evening, entirely unaware that on the upper floor of a certain Georgian townhouse, something that had been made impossible by 53 layers of fear had arrived, quietly and completely, into the world. And Harry Potter, 100% himself for the first time in his life, turned a page and kept reading.